It begins in a way you might not expect. Not with explosions, not with the turning of gears or the opening of portals, but with something much smaller, quieter. A pause, a breath that lingers in the stillness of memory. Rick, who was always thought of as larger than life, once began as a boy who could not sleep. His mind would hum like a broken machine, restless, always working, always searching for something unseen. And Morty, long before anyone ever thought of him as an adventurer, was a child who sat in shadows, tracing the light as it flickered through curtains, wondering why the world felt both so loud and so lonely at the same time. I want you to know, before we wander into their story, that you are loved, deeply, unconditionally, in a way that doesn't need to be proven or earned. This tale, soft and strange as it may be, is being told with care, for you, for the part of you that longs to rest. And because you matter, I want to ask you, before we begin the deeper telling, where in the world are you listening from? What time is it there, in your quiet corner? However it may be, whether it's early morning or deep into the night, grab your coffee, or your tea if you prefer, and let's drift gently together into this story. Rick's childhood was painted in restless colors. Nights stretched endlessly as though time itself was playing tricks on him. He would lie awake, eyes sharp and glassy, thinking about the way the ceiling cracked in delicate lines like constellations only he could see. His hands could never stay still. They built things, little devices that clicked and hummed, more out of need than ambition. Each contraption was a lullaby made of wires and sparks, an attempt to calm the storm of thoughts that would not quiet. He wasn't a genius then, not in the way the universe would someday know him. He was simply a boy trying to find sleep in the only way he knew, by making noise sound like order. Somewhere else, in another quiet house, Morty was different. His silence wasn't restless. It was tender, almost fragile. He had a way of sitting by windows as if the light itself was speaking to him. His family often overlooked him, not out of cruelty, but out of the loudness of their own lives. Morty grew used to the background, to being the soft note in a song filled with sharper chords. And yet there was something in that stillness, a quiet curiosity that made him notice things others missed. A moth's wings trembling, the sound of water moving through pipes, the way a shadow bent just slightly at dusk. Two children in different times and places, both learning in their own strange ways how to listen. Rick to the endless hum of thought, Morty to the subtle music of silence. Neither knew, not yet, that one day they would walk together into countless worlds, searching not for conquest but for a sense of understanding. There's something mysterious about beginnings. We often imagine they're sharp and clear, like doors opening. But more often, they're gentle and hidden, like whispers behind walls. Rick and Morty's story didn't begin the first time they stepped into a portal. It began in these small, unnoticed hours, when a boy built machines to fight his sleeplessness, and another boy dreamed quietly of light and shadows. As Rick grew older, his machines became sharper, louder, stranger. People began to whisper about his brilliance, but brilliance is often a lonely thing. Each success felt hollow, like eating without taste. He longed for someone who could understand not his inventions, but the ache behind them. And yet he hid that ache beneath laughter, beneath arrogance, beneath bottles that clinked in the night. Morty, in his own way, also grew. He didn't become louder, but he did become steadier. While the world pushed past him, he learned how to listen even more deeply. To people's pauses, to their hesitations, to the things they meant but never said. His kindness was quiet, almost invisible. but it was real. When people spoke to him, they often found themselves saying more than they meant, as though his silence pulled honesty gently out of them. Years passed like soft rain. The universe grew wider, stranger, more chaotic, and somehow, through paths too complicated to trace, the restless builder and the silent dreamer found each other. At first, it didn't seem like much. An old man, sharp and impatient, dragging along a boy who seemed nervous, hesitant, unsure. But underneath, there was a resonance, the hum of sleeplessness meeting the hush of shadows. Rick saw, perhaps without meaning to, a softness in Morty that he had buried long ago in himself. And Morty saw, though he couldn't name it, a weariness in Rick that he instinctively wanted to soothe. That first connection wasn't loud, it wasn't a shout or a spark. It was more like the moment you realize someone else hears the same melody you've been humming to yourself in secret. Small, fragile, but undeniable. Rick once muttered to Morty on one of their early walks, "The universe doesn't care about you, kid." He said it like a knife, like a lesson meant to harden him. But Morty didn't flinch. He just looked at Rick, his voice soft. "Maybe it doesn't, but I care about you." Rick didn't answer. He couldn't. But later that night, when Morty had fallen asleep, Rick sat awake, staring at the stars, and whispered words he had never said before. That's enough. It was in that quiet that their bond truly began. Childhood had shaped them in opposite ways. One through restless fire, the other through patient shadow. Yet together they found a balance neither had known they needed. The restless boy who built machines and the quiet boy who listened to light began to walk side by side, not as hero and sidekick, but as mirrors of each other. And so the story begins, not with explosions, but with something smaller. A sleepless boy, a dreaming boy, and the faint, almost invisible thread of care that tied them together before either of them even knew it. The universe stretched endlessly before them, waiting. But for now, it was enough that they had found each other, enough that even in silence, they were not alone. The first time they stepped into a world that wasn't their own, it wasn't loud, it wasn't the bursting glow of invention or the shout of discovery. It was quiet, almost uncertain, like stepping into a dream you weren't sure you belonged in. The sky above was the color of old glass, shifting between blues and greens, and the air carried the faint hum of something alive, though no creatures could be seen. Morty held Rick's arm a little too tightly, his eyes darting, his breath shallow. Rick didn't comment on it, though he noticed. Instead, he muttered something about coordinates, his voice gruff and clipped, as if technical details could cover the silence. But silence has a way of seeping through. Morty's hand trembled slightly as he let go of Rick's sleeve, and for a moment Rick glanced at him, not in annoyance, but in a kind of quiet wonder he would never admit. He remembered suddenly being a boy himself, standing under skies that didn't quite make sense, wondering if he'd ever stop feeling so small. He hadn't. But seeing Morty there, fragile and curious, it was as though he was looking at a younger version of himself that hadn't yet closed all the doors to tenderness. They walked. The ground beneath them was soft, almost like wet sand, though it left no trace of their steps. Every sound seemed to echo gently, stretching further than it should, as if the air itself wanted to hold on to their presence. Morty whispered, though he wasn't sure why. "It feels, kind of empty here, Rick." Rick grunted, his usual sharpness dulled. "Most places are, Morty. People just don't notice." The words hung between them. Morty didn't argue. He rarely did, but he felt the weight of them, the truth and the sadness laced inside. He thought about his own home, how sometimes it felt noisy with arguments and laughter that wasn't meant for him, and how in that noise he too felt empty. Perhaps emptiness wasn't the absence of things, but the absence of being seen. As they wandered, they came upon a pool of water so still it might have been glass. Rick crouched near it, tapping the surface with a small tool, watching the ripples form perfect circles. Morty leaned over, expecting to see his reflection. Instead, he saw something else, himself, yes, but older, eyes lined with quiet sadness. He blinked, and the image faded back into the boy he knew. His chest tightened, though he couldn't explain why. Rick noticed, though he pretended not to. He muttered something about quantum reflection anomalies, but Morty wasn't listening. He was thinking about the man he had just seen in the water. Was that who he was meant to become? Or was it just the trick of a strange world? He wanted to ask Rick, but he knew the answer would be wrapped in sarcasm, or worse, silence. So instead he stayed quiet, pressing the image into the folds of his memory where it would rest like a stone at the bottom of a river. They kept walking, and the world shifted subtly around them. The sky grew dimmer, the air heavier, as though they were moving through layers of someone else's dream. Rick's steps were steady, but Morty's were slower, dragging slightly. At last, Rick stopped. He looked at Morty, his gaze unreadable, and asked in a tone softer than usual, "You tired?" Morty blinked, surprised at the gentleness. "A little," he admitted. Rick nodded, then sat down on a low rock, pulling a small flask from his coat. He took a sip, handed it wordlessly to Morty, who shook his head. For a while, they just sat. Neither spoke. The silence wasn't empty this time. It was full, like a shared blanket. Morty found himself watching Rick's profile, the way the lines of his face seemed carved not by age, but by weariness. He thought of all the things Rick must have seen, all the places he must have been, and wondered if anyone had ever asked him how it felt. He wanted to ask, but the words stuck. He was too young, too unsure. But maybe, he thought, sitting there quietly was enough. Rick, for his part, felt the weight of Morty's gaze. He didn't look back, but he knew. And though he said nothing, he felt something stir in him, a faint, forgotten warmth. He had spent so long convincing himself that connection was useless, that caring was a weakness. Yet here was this boy who looked at him not as a genius, not as a danger, but as someone worth sitting beside. It unsettled him more than any alien world could. Eventually the sky above them shifted again, stars appearing where none had been before. They weren't like the stars of home. These were larger, slower, glowing with a softness that felt almost alive. Morty pointed, whispering, "They look like they're breathing." Rick followed his gaze. He could have explained it. Something about gas formations, about atmospheric distortions. But, for once, he didn't. He just said quietly, "Yeah, breathing." It was in that moment, under a sky that pulsed like a living heart, that Morty realized something important. He didn't have to understand everything. He didn't have to fight or solve or prove. Sometimes it was enough to sit quietly with someone you cared about and let the stars breathe for you. Rick didn't say it, but he felt it too. For a man who had built machines to control everything, to measure and calculate and bend reality, there was an odd relief in letting something simply exist without explanation. In Morty's presence, he found himself able, just barely, to allow that. When they finally stood to leave, Morty felt different. He couldn't name it, but something in him had shifted, like a door cracked open. Rick noticed the change in his eyes, though he said nothing. He simply adjusted the device on his wrist, opened a quiet ripple in the air, and gestured for Morty to step through first. It wasn't much, not in the grand scheme of things, but it was something. A small act of care disguised as impatience. Morty stepped through, his heart a little steadier, his steps a little surer. Rick followed, carrying with him the faint echo of stars that breathed and the memory of silence that wasn't empty. And though neither of them said it, both knew something had begun. Not the kind of beginning that blares like a trumpet, but the kind that hums softly beneath your skin, like a lullaby you almost forgot you knew. Morning came slowly, not like the harsh arrival of sun through windows, but like a gentle glow that seemed to seep through every corner of the world. Rick and Morty found themselves on a planet that was neither cold nor warm, a place that felt suspended between one dream and the next. The air was soft, carrying a faint scent of something sweet, almost like honey, though nothing that could be tasted. Morty breathed deeply, letting the calm wrap around him, a rare comfort after nights of restless thought and shadowed memories. Rick was already moving, his hands adjusting gadgets, checking readings that meant nothing to Morty, but gave Rick some sense of order in the strange, quiet world. Morty watched him, noticing small things, the way Rick's brow furrowed ever so slightly when something was out of balance, or how his eyes sometimes softened when he thought no one was looking. There were moments, fleeting and rare, when Rick's usual sharpness seemed to bend into a gentle curiosity, and Morty felt almost hopeful that the man wasn't entirely unreachable. They walked a little further, the ground beneath them soft and pliant, like walking on thick moss that gave under their weight, but offered gentle resistance. Morty's steps were hesitant at first, but gradually he began to notice the small miracles hidden in the ordinary. A flower that glowed faintly underfoot, petals that curved as though bowing to the soft breeze. Tiny creatures almost invisible that flickered like sparks between the roots of luminous trees. Morty's hand reached out instinctively, touching the air as if he could grasp the quiet magic, and Rick's glance followed. He didn't comment. He rarely did. But the silence between them was not uncomfortable. It had grown into something soft, almost protective. They came across a stream, water so clear it reflected not only their forms, but fragments of their thoughts, as though the liquid held more than light. Morty bent down, running a hand through it. He saw his reflection shift and shimmer, showing him older, braver, and somehow more at peace than he felt. He looked at Rick, whose own reflection rippled like liquid metal, harder and sharper, yet beneath it, something almost human seemed to stir. Morty whispered, "Do you ever wonder if we could be different?" Rick didn't answer immediately. He tilted his head, eyes narrowing thoughtfully, and finally muttered, "We already are, Morty." Every day, just by moving forward. Morty nodded slowly. He felt the truth in that, though he couldn't name it. There was no explosion, no triumphant declaration, just the quiet reminder that even in strange worlds, even in moments that seemed insignificant, change was happening. They continued walking, and the trees around them began to shift, not violently, not unnaturally, but gently, like the world itself was breathing with them. Shadows lengthened and bent in ways that suggested memory more than physics. Morty paused, staring at one that seemed to ripple like liquid silver, and realized that perhaps this was what journeys were meant to be. Not challenges to overcome, but experiences to observe, to feel, to remember. Rick, noticing Morty's pause, offered a small smirk that didn't reach the corners of his eyes. "Don't get too sentimental, Morty," he said, though the edge of harshness was missing. It was strange. Morty had learned to read between the words, to notice the tone and the slight loosening of posture, and he understood more than Rick probably thought. Sometimes the things left unsaid carried more weight than all the words in the universe. A breeze stirred, carrying whispers of sound that neither of them could identify. Rick adjusted a dial on his wrist device, making small corrections to compensate for the strange energy that hummed in the air. Morty crouched to examine a leaf that had fluttered to the ground. Its edges were translucent, glowing faintly, and it seemed almost alive, trembling in place as if aware of them. Morty reached to touch it, hesitated, then let it be, understanding that some things were meant to be observed, not possessed. Time passed, though they did not measure it. In this world, moments stretched and contracted unpredictably, and Morty found it easier to let himself drift with the rhythm rather than resist it. He felt Rick's presence beside him, steady yet unpredictable, a companion who was as much a mystery as the worlds they traversed. He remembered nights at home when the world outside seemed too loud, too sharp, too confusing. Here there was clarity, not in explanation, but in feeling. Eventually they reached a hill that overlooked a valley of soft light. The colors were indescribable, shifting in ways that made the eye want to rest rather than focus. Rick leaned against a rock, finally letting the quiet settle over him. Morty stood beside him, feeling the weight of the strange peace that had grown between them. "It's nice," Morty said softly. "Being here, like it's safe to just exist." Rick didn't reply immediately, but his eyes traced the horizon, watching the gentle glow pulse and fade. Finally he muttered, "It is. But don't tell anyone I said that." Morty smiled faintly. It didn't need to be said out loud. He understood. Moments like this were fragile. Too much attention could break them, and yet they were the moments that mattered most. He realized that perhaps these small, quiet experiences were what shaped them more than any adventure, any fight, any invention. The world outside could wait. The universe could hum with chaos. Here, in these pauses, in these glimmers, they were learning something deeper: patience, observation, and the subtle art of being present. As the day faded, the sky shifted again, turning from the soft greens and blues of morning to the gentle purples and silvers of evening. Stars appeared, not in sharp points, but as soft glows, each breathing slowly in the vast expanse above. Morty felt a gentle awe settle into him, a quiet recognition that the universe was larger than fear or doubt, and yet it was also intimate enough to hold moments like this, small, shared, delicate. Rick finally spoke, in a voice barely above a whisper, "We'll move on soon, Morty. But remember this, don't let the quiet go unnoticed. It's more valuable than any chaos you'll ever face." Morty nodded, feeling the weight of the words without fully understanding them. Perhaps that was the point. Some lessons were not meant to be dissected immediately. They were meant to be felt, stored in the quiet places of the heart. As night fully descended, they made camp under a tree whose leaves glowed faintly, illuminating the space around them like a soft lantern. Morty lay back, looking up at the gentle stars, feeling both small and seen. Rick sat beside him, silent, his presence a grounding force. And in that moment, the universe felt infinite, yet tender. There were no alarms, no urgent tasks, no rush, just two travelers learning the subtle rhythms of strange worlds and of each other. And though neither spoke, both understood that beginnings were never loud, endings were never sharp, and that the journey, slow, quiet, sometimes confusing, was the thing that mattered most. And somewhere between the pulsing stars and the soft glow of the ground, Morty finally allowed himself to feel the rarest kind of peace, that even in the unknown, he was not alone. The world they stepped into this time was quieter, almost tender in its strangeness. Nothing shimmered violently or shouted for attention. The sky was a muted lavender, stretching endlessly, and the air carried a faint hum, like a heartbeat from far away. Morty walked slowly, noticing the way the ground shifted beneath his feet, soft as moss but firm enough to support him. Rick followed, hands in his pockets, eyes scanning the horizon with a calm sharpness that Morty had begun to recognize not as impatience, but as a kind of gentle care. They came to a small stream, its waters flowing lazily through the valley. Morty knelt beside it, watching his reflection ripple and blur, and felt a strange mix of curiosity and nostalgia. The boy in the water stared back at him, wide-eyed, innocent, unaware of the many roads ahead. Morty touched the surface gently, and for a moment the reflection seemed to smile, as though acknowledging him, recognizing him. Rick crouched beside him without a word, letting the quiet between them fill the space. "This place," Morty whispered, "it's like it's waiting for something, or someone." Rick hummed softly, not replying, but his fingers tapped lightly against the metal of his watch. He didn't need to answer. Morty already felt the subtle lesson that sometimes things exist without explanation, simply to be experienced. They walked further, moving between trees that bent slightly as if bowing to their passage. Leaves glowed faintly, casting gentle shadows that danced like memories across that soft ground. Morty thought of home, of rooms filled with noise and people who often didn't see him. Here, in this quiet, he felt noticed without words, seen without demand. It was a rare feeling, one he didn't fully understand, but he cherished it nonetheless. Rick paused at a rock that looked ordinary, but was warm to the touch. He ran a hand along its surface, murmuring to himself about energy readings that meant little to Morty. But Morty noticed the way Rick's brow relaxed, the subtle ease in his posture that appeared only when he wasn't performing, only when he was simply present. Morty wondered how long it had been since Rick had felt this unguarded, this unpressured. He wanted to ask, but he didn't. Sometimes, he knew, silence spoke more than words ever could. They continued until the stream widened into a shallow lake, its surface reflecting not just the lavender sky, but faint glimmers of light that danced like tiny lanterns. Morty stepped closer, feeling the cool mist on his face, and realized that the water was alive in some quiet way. It wasn't rushing or roaring, it simply existed, steady and patient. Morty watched his reflection again, older now, steadier, with a quiet strength he didn't yet feel he fully deserved. Rick stood beside him, his own reflection fragmented and shifting, yet underneath there was a softness Morty had not expected to see. For a long while they said nothing. Morty listened to the gentle lap of water, the whisper of wind through luminous leaves, and the faint hum that seemed to pulse from the very ground beneath them. Rick fiddled with a small device but didn't speak, his usual sarcasm muted by the calm of the world around them. Morty felt a warmth spread through his chest, a subtle recognition that moments like this, rare, fleeting, quiet, were the true treasures of their travels. The sky darkened slowly, folding itself into deeper purples and soft blues. Stars appeared, scattered in patterns that seemed familiar yet entirely new. Morty tilted his head, trying to trace constellations that didn't exist anywhere he had ever known. Rick finally spoke, his voice unusually soft. "Somewhere in all these stars, there's a path for everyone. Even if you can't see it yet." Morty listened carefully, feeling the words settle in him, not as instruction, but as reassurance. It wasn't the kind of guidance he expected from Rick, but it mattered all the same. They walked along the lake's edge until they came upon a fallen tree, its trunk wide enough to sit on. Morty climbed up carefully, then gestured for Rick to join him. They sat together side by side, not speaking, letting the quiet stretch between them like a comforting blanket. Morty's thoughts drifted naturally, wandering through memories and dreams, recalling moments when he had felt invisible or too small. Now, with Rick beside him, those memories seemed less sharp, softened by presence and companionship. Rick finally turned his gaze toward Morty, eyes catching the faint starlight. "You notice things, Morty," he said quietly. "Things others don't. It's useful. Don't lose it." Morty's lips curved into a small smile. He didn't fully understand what Rick meant, but he felt the sincerity in the tone, a rare honesty that made his chest feel lighter. It was not praise, nor instruction. It was recognition, and Morty realized that was worth more than either of the other two things. Night deepened, and the glow from the lake and trees grew softer, bathing everything in gentle light. Morty leaned back on the tree trunk, feeling the warmth beneath him, listening to the faint rhythm of the world. Rick remained upright, still alert, yet less tense than usual. The air itself seemed to slow, as if waiting for them to settle into it, to become part of its calm flow. Morty's thoughts drifted toward the future, toward unknown worlds they would visit, and he felt a quiet excitement that had nothing to do with adventure and everything to do with connection. Eventually, Rick pulled a small object from his coat, a device that hummed faintly, and began to adjust it, preparing their departure. Morty watched him, feeling a mixture of curiosity and gentle anticipation. He realized that the journeys themselves weren't the point. It was the shared experience, the quiet companionship, the subtle lessons hidden between steps and breaths. Rick looked over at him briefly, the corner of his mouth twitching almost imperceptibly. Morty thought it might be a smile, though he wasn't sure. Before stepping away from the tree, Morty closed his eyes for a moment, letting the soft glow of stars and the gentle hum of the world fill him. He felt steadier, more rooted, as though something in this quiet, strange place had settled into the rhythm of his heart. Rick's presence beside him was grounding, yet liberating. Morty realized he didn't have to understand everything, didn't have to have all the answers. Sometimes it was enough simply to be, to notice, to breathe with the world and with someone who cared enough to be near. They rose together, stepping toward the softly glowing horizon. Neither spoke, and neither needed to. The night embraced them, folding them into its quiet rhythm. The stars pulsed gently overhead, the water rippled with subtle energy, and the trees whispered softly, as if approving their presence. Morty glanced at Rick, and for the first time he thought he saw something more than genius or restlessness in the older man. He saw someone capable of tenderness, of quiet understanding, of holding space for another without words. And so as they moved forward, the night settling around them like a soft blanket, Morty understood something he had never fully grasped, that journeys weren't always about discovery or danger or excitement. They were about noticing the quiet, about cherishing the soft moments, about being present with someone who mattered. Rick and Morty continued walking side by side, their steps gentle and synchronized. The world around them remained strange and surreal, yet in that strangeness, a kind of peace had taken root. Morty felt it settle in his chest, warm and steady, a promise unspoken but understood. The universe stretched on, infinite and unpredictable, yet in that moment it felt tender, watchful and kind. The morning arrived softly, as if the world itself had decided to take a breath before fully waking. Rick and Morty found themselves in a valley where the light was neither sharp nor dim, but a gentle, diffused glow that made every surface appear like it had been brushed with memory. The air smelled faintly of something sweet and earthy, a scent that stirred distant recollections neither of them could name. Morty walked slowly, letting his fingers brush against the soft grasses, feeling the subtle vibrations of the ground beneath him. Rick followed, his movements deliberate, measured, as though he were learning to pace himself in a world that did not demand haste. They approached a cluster of trees whose trunks curved like gentle arches, creating a natural tunnel of leaves overhead. The leaves glowed faintly, illuminating the ground with patterns that shifted and changed, like light filtering through water. Morty paused, noticing how each leaf seemed to have its own subtle pulse, a rhythm that was almost alive. He reached out, and for a moment the air itself seemed to respond, as though recognizing his touch. Rick glanced at him, eyebrows raised, but said nothing. He knew that some things were meant to be experienced, not explained. A stream meandered through the valley, its waters clear and slow-moving, reflecting the gentle light above. Morty knelt at its edge, dipping his fingers into the cool liquid. His reflection shimmered, and for a brief moment he saw not himself, but a version of Rick, younger, softer, eyes less hardened by the years he had yet to live. Morty pulled back, heart quickening, unsure whether the image was real or a trick of the water. Rick crouched beside him, eyes scanning the stream, a faint hum of thought vibrating from him. "Water carries memories, Morty," he said quietly. "Sometimes it shows more than it should." Morty nodded, though he didn't fully understand. That was okay. Some truths were meant to be felt before they could be explained. They followed the stream further into the valley, the ground giving way to small rises and gentle slopes. Morty noticed the way Rick moved differently here, not with the usual restless energy, but with quiet deliberation, as though he were taking in every detail of the world. Morty realized then that he was learning from Rick in ways that went beyond instruction or advice. He was learning to notice, to feel, to allow the subtle currents of a world to brush against him without fear or distraction. At the center of the valley was a small pond, its surface so still it mirrored the sky perfectly. Morty approached it slowly, captivated by the clarity. As he gazed, he thought he saw movement beneath the surface, not fish, not creatures he could name, but shapes that swirled and shifted like living shadows. Rick stood beside him, silent, watching the reflections in the water. "It's okay to look, Morty," he murmured. "But don't try to catch it. Some things aren't meant to be owned." Morty nodded, understanding the quiet lesson. Ownership, he realized, could ruin the wonder of what was meant simply to be witnessed. They sat by the pond for a long while, letting the world breathe around them. Morty closed his eyes, listening to the soft hum of leaves, the whisper of the stream, and the faint rhythm of Rick's presence nearby. He felt a deep, unfamiliar calm settle over him, as though all the worries and doubts he had carried were dissolving into the soft light of the valley. Rick, for his part, seemed equally absorbed, though in a different way. He was always observing, calculating, measuring, but here he allowed himself to simply be, to exist alongside Morty without expectation or demand. As the day stretched on, shadows lengthened and bent, forming shapes that suggested stories rather than facts. Morty traced them with his eyes, feeling a quiet connection to the world and to Rick. He realized that adventures were not only about traveling to new places, but also about noticing the subtle truths hidden in them. Rick, too, seemed to feel this, though he never said it aloud. In the pauses between movement, in the quiet exchanges of glances, in the shared silences, a bond deepened, unspoken but undeniable. A gentle breeze stirred, carrying the faint scent of flowers and something else Morty could not name. He inhaled slowly, letting it fill his lungs and settle into his chest. Rick adjusted a small device on his wrist, the subtle whirring barely audible over the sound of nature. Morty watched him, sensing the care behind every movement. He thought about how long Rick had traveled alone, how many worlds he had crossed without this kind of companionship, and how fragile and rare it was to find someone who noticed and accepted without judgment. Evening approached, soft and forgiving. The sky transformed into muted hues of lavender and silver, and stars began to appear, not in sharp points, but as gentle glimmers that pulsed slowly as if breathing. Morty leaned back on the soft grass, feeling the cool earth beneath him, and let the quiet wash over him. Rick sat beside him, shoulders relaxed, in a way Morty had rarely seen, watching the stars with a faraway expression. Morty felt a connection so profound it didn't need words. "Do you ever think about why we're here?" Morty asked, voice barely audible. Rick didn't answer immediately. He studied the horizon, the gentle folds of light and shadow, before finally saying, "Sometimes. But I think it's less about why and more about noticing what is while it's here. That's the part people often miss." Morty nodded, absorbing the words. He felt the weight of them in his chest, a quiet truth that he hadn't known he was ready to understand. Night deepened, and the valley seemed to fold in on itself with the softness of dusk. Morty closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the gentle sounds of the world, feeling the rhythm of the stream, the hum of life around them, and the quiet presence of Rick at his side. It was a rare peace, delicate and profound, and he savored it. He realized that moments like these, unremarkable to the outside eye, were the ones that truly shape them. Small, soft, almost invisible lessons etched into memory. Rick finally stirred, adjusting the small device in his hand. He stood and extended a hand to Morty, helping him up. The stars above pulsed faintly, as though approving their movement. Morty felt a calm excitement for the journey ahead, not for adventure or danger, but for the subtle wonders he knew awaited him. He understood that the quiet, the small acts, the moments of noticing and presence were far more significant than any grand display. Together they began to walk again, side by side, through the soft valley. The night embraced them, gentle and infinite, carrying the faint hum of all that had been observed and remembered. Morty's heart felt lighter, his steps steadier, and in the quiet companionship of Rick, he discovered a subtle, enduring truth, that the most extraordinary journeys are often the ones that unfold quietly, beneath the surface of noise and expectation. And in that moment, as they moved forward under the soft pulse of stars, Morty felt the rare, delicate warmth of connection, a truth that did not need to be declared, only held, cherished, and remembered. The morning light was soft, spilling across the landscape like a slow sigh. Rick and Morty stepped into a forest where the trees seemed taller than reason, their branches reaching like careful hands toward a sky that shimmered with muted golds and blues. Each step Morty took sank slightly into the ground, which was soft and cool beneath his feet, almost like walking on a carpet made from moss and memory. Rick moved beside him, quiet, purposeful, adjusting a device at his wrist, but his attention seemed caught by the rhythm of the forest itself. Morty noticed it immediately, the way the leaves swayed not only with the wind, but as if they were listening, as if they were alive in ways that weren't immediately visible. They followed a narrow path winding between the immense trunks the air carrying a faint hum, almost like whispered conversation. Morty's eyes traced the patterns of light filtering through the canopy, soft beams that curved and danced, painting the ground in gentle mosaics. He took a deep breath and let himself sink into the quiet rhythm of the place, feeling the tension in his shoulders ease. Rick's presence beside him was steady, not intrusive, but grounding, and Morty realized that sometimes simply being near someone who noticed you was more important than anything else the universe could offer. They came upon a small clearing where the light pooled in the center, glowing as though the ground itself was radiating warmth. In the middle, a pool of water shimmered with subtle colors that Morty couldn't name, reflecting the sky above in distorted perfection. He approached it cautiously, fingers brushing the surface, and saw something strange. Not his reflection alone, but fleeting glimpses of worlds he hadn't yet visited, faces he might one day meet, and moments that had not yet happened. He gasped softly, drawing back. Rick crouched beside him, observing the pool with a calm focus. "Quantum impressions," he muttered quietly. "This place records more than we can perceive. Don't get lost in it." Morty nodded, swallowing his awe. Sometimes he understood less by trying to understand. They moved on, following the forest path as it twisted and turned, leading them past trees with leaves that glimmered faintly, as if remembering light from ages past. Morty watched the subtle shimmer, and he felt a growing wonder that didn't demand words. He wanted to reach out and touch everything, to feel the hum beneath the soft bark, to understand the whispers in the breeze. Rick, noticing his fascination, simply said, "Some things are meant to be noticed, Morty, not touched. Learning that takes time." Morty nodded again, taking the lesson into the quiet folds of his mind. As the day progressed, the forest began to change subtly. The soft gold of morning shifted into muted greens and silvers, and the air grew cooler, carrying a faint, earthy scent, like rain that had not yet fallen. Morty's steps slowed, absorbing the subtle beauty of each moment, while Rick's eyes scanned the surroundings with a steady vigilance that made Morty feel protected without being constrained. He realized that in this strange companionship, he was learning more than he had ever expected: patience, observation, and the quiet power of noticing without rushing. They reached a gentle rise, and at the top, Morty saw the forest stretching endlessly beneath a sky that shimmered like glass. The light bent in soft waves, illuminating the trees and ground in patterns that made the world feel simultaneously vast and intimate. Rick stood beside him silently, and Morty felt the comfort of presence, how it could be enough without explanations, without directives, without movement. He exhaled slowly, letting the calm seep into his chest, filling the hollow spaces he hadn't realized existed. A gentle breeze stirred the leaves, and a faint melody seemed to emerge from the forest itself. A song without words, soft and haunting, carrying a sense of memory and longing. Morty closed his eyes, listening, and realized that he had been holding tension in his body, holding questions and doubts that the world couldn't answer. Here, in this quiet, strange forest, he could let them go. He felt lighter, as if the melody of the forest had drawn out the weight he had carried for months, for years. Rick finally spoke, his voice unusually soft. "It's easy to get caught up in chaos, Morty. Harder to notice what matters quietly. You're learning that." Morty opened his eyes, meeting Rick's gaze. There was no sarcasm, no urgency, only the weight of experience and observation. Morty felt a quiet pride, a subtle understanding that growth didn't always roar. Sometimes it whispered in the folds of light and shadow, in the rhythm of a forest and the presence of someone who cared. As evening approached, the forest glowed faintly under the gentle hues of the setting sky. Stars began to shimmer above, soft points of light that pulsed slowly, like breathing. Morty leaned against the trunk of a tree, feeling the cool bark beneath his hand, and let the quiet embrace him. Rick sat beside him, shoulders relaxed, his usual tension softened by the calm of the world. Morty realized then that the journey itself, the quiet moments, the small acts of observation, the shared silences, was the true lesson. Adventure, danger, chaos, all of that paled in comparison to the subtle understanding that grew in these pauses. Night fully descended, and the forest seemed to hum with energy, gentle and continuous. Morty closed his eyes, letting the faint glimmer of stars, the soft whispers of leaves, and the presence of Rick fill him completely. There was no rush, no urgency, no expectation, only the quiet rhythm of existence and the subtle joy of being noticed. He felt connected, grounded, and yet free, the paradox of companionship and independence mingling gently in his chest. Rick finally stood, adjusting a small device that glimmered faintly in the moonlight. He extended a hand to Morty, who took it without hesitation. Together they walked along a narrow path that curved through the glowing forest, the air carrying the faint echo of their footsteps. Morty understood, without needing to say it, that these moments, the quiet, shared pauses in the midst of strangeness, were the ones that truly mattered. And as they moved forward under the soft breathing stars, Morty felt a warmth spread through him. He realized that life, no matter how strange or unpredictable, could hold beauty in the smallest gestures, the rustle of leaves, the shimmer of water, the quiet presence of someone who cared enough to walk beside you. In that gentle understanding, Morty felt a rare peace, a quiet knowledge that even in unknown worlds he was not alone. And with that they continued, stepping softly into the next part of their journey, side by side, letting the calm of the forest and the rhythm of the night guide them forward into experiences yet unseen, yet quietly promising. The day opened softly, like a sigh stretching across the sky. Rick and Morty stepped onto a plain that seemed to shimmer under a diffuse light, neither bright nor dim, just enough to make the grass beneath their feet glow faintly. Morty noticed the air carried a subtle scent of warmth and rain, mingled with something he couldn't name, something familiar yet elusive, like a memory half remembered from childhood. Rick moved beside him, adjusting a small device on his wrist, but there was no urgency in his steps. For the first time in many days, Morty felt the world's rhythm matching his own. They walked in silence for a while, the soft crunch of the grass beneath their feet the only sound. Morty's eyes traced the horizon, noting hills that curved gently, rivers that glimmered faintly, and clouds that drifted lazily, reflecting light like soft, molten silver. He realized that he had been holding tension in his chest without noticing it, and with every breath it began to ease. Rick glanced at him occasionally, as if noticing the shift, but said nothing. He didn't need to, presence itself was enough. A breeze stirred, carrying whispers that seemed to rise from the land itself. Morty leaned slightly into it, letting the sound brush against his skin, feeling an unexpected warmth in the quiet touch. Rick adjusted his device again, then stopped, watching Morty with a faint, thoughtful expression. Morty smiled slightly, sensing that Rick had noticed more than he usually admitted. Sometimes Rick's silence spoke louder than words, and Morty had learned to hear it. They came upon a shallow pond, its surface like liquid glass, reflecting the clouds and the soft, golden hue of the sun. Morty knelt at its edge, dipping his fingers into the water. His reflection shimmered, showing him not only as he was, but flickers of who he could become. stronger, calmer, more aware of the world's gentle rhythms. Rick crouched beside him, studying the water intently. "It's all about noticing, Morty," he said softly. "Everything leaves an impression if you pay attention." Morty nodded, feeling the weight of the words in a quiet, grounding way. They wandered further into the plain, passing clusters of flowers that glowed faintly in response to their steps. Morty paused, observing one delicate blossom that bent slightly as if acknowledging him. He reached out, then hesitated, letting it remain untouched. There was a lesson in restraint, he realized, a gentle reminder that beauty sometimes demanded observation rather than possession. Rick walked beside him, silent, yet Morty felt the unspoken confirmation that he understood. The day shifted slowly toward evening. The sky melted into muted shades of violet and silver, and stars began to glimmer faintly above. Morty and Rick came to a rise overlooking the plains below. The soft wind carried a sense of stillness, of observation, of quiet presence. Morty leaned on the edge of the rise, letting the world stretch before him, a vast expanse filled with soft light and subtle movement. Rick's hand hovered near Morty's shoulder but did not touch. It was enough that he was there, steady and calm. Morty spoke softly, almost to himself. "Do you think we'll always find places like this?" Rick didn't answer immediately. He seemed to consider, eyes tracing the horizon, the shifting shadows and light. Finally he said, "Places like this aren't found, Morty. They exist in moments. You carry them with you if you learn to notice." Morty smiled faintly, understanding not fully, yet feeling the truth in it. It was the kind of lesson that didn't need explanation. It simply settled into the chest and stayed there, warm and persistent. They moved on, stepping carefully through the soft grass. Shadows lengthened, bending gently with the evening light, forming shapes that suggested stories rather than facts. Morty traced them with his eyes, feeling a strange kinship with the patterns. He realized that adventures were not always in the noise or chaos of worlds beyond. Sometimes they were in the quiet observation of life, in noticing the subtle beauty and rhythm that others overlooked. Rick, walking silently beside him, seemed to share the same understanding, though it was expressed without words. A gentle stream appeared, winding like a silver ribbon through the plains. Morty knelt beside it, feeling the cool water against his palms, listening to the soft murmur as it moved. The water seemed alive in a quiet, secret way, carrying memories and reflections from places neither of them had seen. Rick crouched beside him, observing not the water, but the effect it had on Morty, his sharp eyes softened by something unspoken. Morty felt a surge of gratitude for the rare moments of attention and care, the moments where someone saw him without judgment, without expectation, without hurry. Evening deepened, and the plains were bathed in muted silver light, the stars shimmering softly overhead. Morty leaned back, resting on the grass, closing his eyes for a moment. He felt the rhythm of the wind, the faint pulse of the land beneath him, and the presence of Rick beside him. It was a calm that carried more weight than any excitement, more warmth than any adventure could promise. Rick remained upright, vigilant yet calm, a quiet anchor in the soft folds of the night. Morty thought about home, about the chaos that waited beyond this place, and felt a rare clarity. The lessons of the quiet moments, observation, patience, subtle understanding, were not lost on him. They settled into his chest like seeds, ready to grow into something enduring. He understood that life's greatest journeys were not always measured in distance or danger, but in presence, in noticing, in holding space for another and for the world itself. Rick finally spoke, voice low and thoughtful. "We don't always need to run, Morty. Some of the most important things happen when we simply exist." Morty turned toward him, catching the faintest hint of a smile. It wasn't boastful or loud, it was soft, fleeting, a glimpse of something deeper that Rick rarely shared. Morty felt a warmth spread through his chest, understanding that the quiet companionship, the shared observation, was enough to carry them through anything. Night fully settled, the stars pulsing faintly like soft lanterns overhead. Morty closed his eyes, letting the gentle hum of the world fill him. Rick's presence beside him was steady, grounding, and Morty realized that for the first time he didn't feel the urge to rush, to solve, to chase chaos. There was nothing to fix here, nothing to conquer. Only quiet, only presence, only the soft rhythm of life carrying them forward. They rose together, walking through the plains under the gentle glow of the starlit sky. Morty felt the rare, delicate sense of peace that came from shared understanding, from quiet companionship, from noticing the subtle beauty of the world. The journey ahead was unknown, but he carried with him the lessons of the day: patience, observation, and the quiet power of presence. And as they moved forward side by side, Rick and Morty understood, without speaking, that the most extraordinary journeys were often the ones that unfolded gently, softly, beneath the surface of noise and expectation. Morty felt a warmth in his chest, a quiet assurance that even in strange, unpredictable worlds he was not alone. And with that, they continued into the soft night, letting the stars guide their steps, carrying the gentle rhythm of the plains and the lessons of quiet companionship into the journey yet to come. The morning arrived like a soft whisper, brushing over the landscape with a muted golden glow. Rick and Morty stepped into a canyon that stretched wide and deep, its walls painted in soft, warm hues of red and amber. The air carried the faint scent of stone and something indefinably sweet, like earth remembering sunlight from centuries past. Morty's feet sank slightly into the warm, dusted sand with each step, and he marveled at the way shadows played along the canyon walls, shifting slowly as if the world itself was breathing. Rick walked beside him, adjusting a small, humming device on his wrist, but his eyes softened as he observed the canyon. Morty noticed it immediately, the quiet awe that Rick rarely allowed himself to show. They wandered through the winding paths between the cliffs, the echo of their footsteps blending with the faint rustle of the wind. Morty reached out occasionally, letting his fingers brush against the smooth stone, feeling the subtle warmth and texture beneath his touch. Each wall seemed to carry stories, whispers of worlds unseen, and he realized that in this quiet, strange place, even the stones held lessons. Rick glanced at him occasionally, his expression unreadable, but Morty could sense approval. Observation mattered here, presence mattered more. A shallow stream wound its way through the canyon floor, clear and reflective, capturing the light and bending it into tiny spectrums of color that danced across the sand. Morty knelt beside it, dipping his fingers into the cool water. Ripples spread outward, distorting the reflection of the canyon above, and for a moment, Morty thought he saw something more, a fleeting glimpse of himself, older, steadier, carrying a calm he had not yet fully earned. Rick crouched next to him, his gaze on the water, but his awareness clearly on Morty. "Even the smallest disturbances leave traces," he said quietly. "Notice what matters, Morty, but don't try to control it." Morty nodded, absorbing the weight of the lesson in silence. They continued walking, following the stream as it meandered through the canyon. Small flowers glimmered along the edges, their petals catching the soft light and reflecting faint colors onto the sand. Morty paused, watching one bloom that seemed to glow brighter when he looked directly at it. He leaned closer, but did not touch it, letting it exist untouched, observed, but free. Rick moved beside him, silently acknowledging the lesson. Some beauty exists simply to be noticed, not possessed. Morty felt the warmth of understanding settle in his chest, a rare, quiet satisfaction. The sun dipped lower, painting the canyon in deeper shades of orange and violet. Shadows stretched long and soft, curling around rocks and cliffs like gentle ribbons. Morty felt a pull in his chest, a sense of reflection, of memory blending with present experience. He thought about home, about chaos and noise, about moments when he had felt small and unseen. Here, in this quiet canyon, he felt the opposite, seen, present, important, even without words or declarations. Rick's subtle presence beside him carried that reassurance. As evening approached, they climbed a small rise, and Morty looked down at the canyon floor, stretching endlessly below. The stream shimmered faintly, reflecting the colors of the sunset, and the canyon walls glowed softly as though aware of their passage. Morty exhaled slowly, feeling a gentle weight lift from his shoulders. Rick stood silently beside him, his gaze distant yet focused, and Morty realized that sometimes guidance was quiet, unspoken, woven into the act of simply walking together. A breeze swept through the canyon, carrying whispers of unseen creatures and distant waters. Morty tilted his head, letting the wind brush his face, feeling a subtle warmth that seemed to settle into his chest. Rick adjusted his device once more, the faint hum blending with the soft rhythm of the canyon. Morty understood that the small, quiet details mattered. The way the light shifted, the subtle pulse of the air, the faint echoes of memory in the stones and water. These were the moments that shaped understanding, that grew wisdom without needing explanation. Night approached, and the sky above transformed into deep shades of indigo and silver. Stars began to appear, scattered faintly yet distinctly, shimmering as if breathing with the canyon itself. Morty leaned against a smooth rock, feeling the cool surface beneath his hand, and let the world envelop him in its gentle rhythm. Rick remained standing, vigilant but calm, watching both the sky and Morty, his presence a quiet anchor in the vast, surreal landscape. Morty felt a soft awe, a sense that he was part of something far larger than himself, yet intimately connected to it. Morty spoke softly, almost to himself. "Do you think the world remembers us?" Rick paused, considering. "Not in the way you think, Morty. It remembers our presence, our attention, the care we take to notice. That's the only kind of imprint that matters." Morty nodded, letting the words settle into the folds of his mind. He understood now that significance wasn't always about actions or chaos. It could be about quiet presence, observation, and the small gestures that go unseen but matter profoundly. They walked along the canyon floor, following the winding stream as it reflected the faint starlight. Shadows of rocks and cliffs stretched like gentle, living fingers across the sand. Morty traced them with his eyes, feeling the subtle pulse of the canyon, its quiet rhythm resonating with the beat of his own heart. Rick's presence beside him was constant, unassuming, and Morty felt a rare comfort in knowing that he wasn't walking alone, not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually, in the softest sense of the word. The night deepened, and the canyon seemed to exhale with them, wrapping them in its gentle, breathing embrace. Morty closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the faint hum of water, the whispers of wind, and the subtle vibrations beneath his feet. He felt a rare, quiet joy, a calm certainty that even in strange, unpredictable worlds there could be softness, presence, and care. Rick remained beside him, silent yet undeniably there, grounding the moment with his watchful quiet. Finally, Rick stirred, adjusting his device and extending a hand to Morty. Morty took it, and together they began moving forward along the softly glowing canyon path. Morty's steps were careful, deliberate, carrying the weight of the lessons learned in quiet observation and patient presence. The stars above pulsed gently, guiding them, and the canyon hummed faintly in response, as if approving the careful, gentle passage of their journey. And as they walked side by side into the unfolding night, Morty felt a warmth in his chest, a quiet connection to the canyon, to Rick, and to the gentle pulse of life around them. He realized, without speaking, that the most extraordinary journeys were often the ones that unfolded softly, unnoticed by the world, but deeply felt by those who paused to notice, to breathe, and to be present. And with that they continued, moving quietly into the unknown, carrying the gentle rhythm of the canyon and the lessons of quiet companionship into whatever awaited next, side by side, step by step, heart by heart. The morning unfolded gently, as if the world itself had exhaled overnight and now stretched into wakefulness with slow, deliberate grace. Rick and Morty found themselves at the edge of a vast, mist-draped lake, its surface smooth and silver, reflecting the early light like a quiet promise. The air was cool and soft, carrying the faint scent of water and earth, mingled with the delicate hint of something Morty couldn't name, something that felt like memory and hope combined. Morty took a careful step forward, watching his reflection ripple faintly with the motion, and for a moment he saw not just himself, but fleeting images of times and places he had yet to experience. Rick stood beside him, observing the lake with a quiet intensity that was almost reverent. Morty noticed the way the light caught the edges of his hair, turning it faintly gold, and he felt an unexpected warmth in the stillness between them. There was no urgency, no push to move faster or reach further, only the gentle rhythm of presence. Morty realized that this quiet companionship and shared observation was shaping him more than any adventure ever could. They followed the shoreline, the soft mist curling around their ankles like a delicate veil. Morty reached out occasionally, letting his fingers skim the surface of the water, feeling the cool pulse beneath his touch. Each ripple seemed to carry something intangible, echoes of distant places, hints of dreams, whispers of the lives the lake had observed over countless years. Rick watched quietly, giving Morty the space to absorb it, his own attention on the subtle patterns the world presented. Morty felt a deep calm settle over him, the kind of calm that could only come from being truly present. As they walked, the lake's surface occasionally shimmered with faint, unexpected colors, light bending and twisting in ways that seemed almost alive. Morty paused, watching a pattern that seemed to dance across the water, a soft interplay of silvers, blues, and a hint of rose. It reminded him of a memory he could not fully recall, a sense of comfort and wonder from a childhood long past. Rick, noticing his fascination, said quietly, "Some things don't need names, Morty. They exist to be felt, and that's enough." Morty nodded, absorbing the lesson, without needing more. They moved on, stepping onto a narrow path that curved around the lake's edge. The ground was soft, dotted with small flowers that glowed faintly in the mist. Morty bent to observe one, its petals delicate and iridescent, almost humming with subtle energy. He reached out, then hesitated, allowing it to remain untouched. There was a quiet beauty in restraint, he realized, in letting something exist without altering it. Rick walked beside him, silent but present, sharing the understanding without words. As the day unfolded, the lake seemed to shift with the changing light. Shadows stretched long and soft, curling around rocks and reeds, forming gentle patterns that suggested stories rather than facts. Morty watched them carefully, noticing how subtle variations in light and movement could transform the same landscape into something entirely new. He realized that observation itself was an adventure, a quiet journey that required attention, patience, and care. Rick, walking beside him, seemed to understand this instinctively, allowing Morty to explore it at his own pace. A gentle breeze stirred, carrying the faint scent of blossoms and something else, something deep and timeless, as though the world itself were breathing slowly. Morty closed his eyes, letting the wind brush across his face and settle into his chest. He felt a soft warmth, a rare stillness that seemed to echo inside him. Rick remained beside him, calm and steady, his presence a quiet anchor that allowed Morty to fully immerse himself in the moment. They came to a small wooden dock that extended slightly into the lake. Morty stepped onto it carefully, feeling the gentle sway beneath his feet. He gazed across the water, noticing the faint shimmer of stars beginning to emerge in the sky above. The lake reflected them softly, doubling their quiet brilliance. Morty felt a sense of timelessness, as though this place existed outside of urgency, outside of expectation, a realm where quiet observation and presence were the truest forms of adventure. Rick crouched beside him, resting his hands on his knees, his eyes tracing the faint patterns on the water's surface. "This is the kind of learning that doesn't shout," he said softly. "It whispers. And if you listen carefully, Morty, it can teach more than any chaotic journey ever will." Morty nodded, feeling the depth of the words settle in his chest. He realized that understanding often grew not from action, but from noticing, from breathing, from allowing the world and its subtleties to be felt. Evening approached, soft and forgiving. The sky shifted into muted tones of violet and silver, and the first stars shone faintly, their light mirrored in the still water. Morty leaned against the wooden railing of the dock, letting the coolness of the wood ground him, feeling the gentle pulse of the lake beneath him. Rick stood silently, observing both the stars above and the water below, a quiet guardian of this soft moment. Morty understood that the true journey was not always through chaos or danger. It could be through quiet, attentive presence, in shared silence, in the small miracles unnoticed by most. The night deepened, and the lake seemed to hum softly, its surface rippling gently in the faint breeze. Morty closed his eyes, letting the sounds of water, wind, and distant rustling of leaves fill him completely. He felt a rare peace, a connection to both the world and to Rick, a calm assurance that he was exactly where he needed to be. Rick, silent but present, remained a grounding force, reminding him that companionship could be a quiet, sustaining energy, as vital as air or water. Morty spoke softly, almost to himself. "Do you think places like this remember us?" Rick considered for a moment before replying, "Not in the way you might imagine. They remember our attention, our presence, the care we take to notice. That's what endures." Morty absorbed the truth quietly, feeling it sink into him. Significance, he realized, was not always about action or accomplishment. It was in the small, mindful moments of existence, in the gentle observation and shared presence. Finally, Rick extended a hand to Morty, helping him rise from the dock. They began walking along the mist-draped path once more, the stars above shimmering faintly, guiding their steps. Morty's movements were careful, measured, carrying the lessons of the day: patience, observation, quiet attention, and the gentle reassurance of companionship. The lake reflected the stars softly, the water moving in tiny ripples as if breathing along with them. And as they walked side by side into the unfolding night, Morty felt a warmth spread through him, a quiet understanding that the most profound journeys often occurred in stillness, in noticing, and in shared presence. Even in unpredictable, strange worlds, he understood that there could be softness, care, and quiet wonder. And with that they continued, moving gently into the unknown, carrying the quiet rhythm of the lake, the subtle lessons of observation, and the enduring warmth of companionship into the night ahead. The sun rose softly over the horizon, casting pale gold light across a valley that seemed almost untouched by time. Rick and Morty walked slowly into the open, their shadows stretching long and thin across the soft grass. The air smelled faintly of dew and distant blooms, carrying a quiet freshness that seemed to wake not only the senses, but something deeper inside them. Morty felt his chest loosen as he inhaled, as if each breath drew out the lingering tension from days long past. Rick walked beside him, his presence steady, offering quiet assurance without need for words. The valley held a gentle hush, broken only by the occasional call of a bird or the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. Morty's eyes traced the contours of the land, noticing the subtle shifts in color and light, the way shadows curved along the gentle hills. He realized, slowly, that observing the world this carefully, without rushing, allowed him to notice patterns and beauty he had never seen before. Rick adjusted a small device on his wrist, the faint hum blending seamlessly with the quiet rhythm of the valley, and Morty felt a sense of peace in the shared stillness. They approached a cluster of ancient trees, their trunks wide and knotted, bark rough and warm under Morty's fingertips. He ran his hand along one trunk, feeling the pulse of life within it, the slow, steady rhythm of growth and resilience. Rick watched him, his expression unreadable, but Morty sensed a quiet approval. These small interactions, the gentle noticing of details, were shaping him in ways that chaotic adventures never could. He felt a subtle pride, not loud or boastful, but quiet and grounding, settling deep into his chest. A narrow stream wound through the valley, its water clear and moving with a soft murmur that seemed almost like speech. Morty knelt at the edge, letting his hands touch the cool current. Tiny ripples formed and spread, reflecting the light in patterns that shifted with every breath of wind. Morty's reflection shimmered on the surface, and for a moment he thought he glimpsed not just himself, but echoes of who he might become, calmer, more present, more in tune with the subtle rhythms of the world. Rick crouched beside him, observing the stream, and Morty both, his eyes soft in a way Morty rarely saw. They continued along the stream, stepping carefully over stones and soft patches of moss. Flowers glimmered faintly along the edges, their colors muted but alive, bending gently toward the passing wind. Morty leaned closer to one bloom, noticing the intricate curves of its petals and the faint shimmer of dew. He resisted the urge to touch it, letting it exist in quiet perfection, observed but unaltered. Rick walked beside him, silent but present, and Morty understood that sometimes the most profound lessons were felt in restraint, in appreciation, without interference. The valley gradually opened into a gentle slope, and Morty paused to take in the view. Rolling hills stretched far into the distance, bathed in soft, fading sunlight. Shadows lengthened and curled across the land, forming shapes that seemed to tell stories if one only had the patience to notice. Morty exhaled slowly, letting the calm sink into him. He felt the quiet satisfaction of understanding that some journeys were not measured in distance or chaos, but in the careful observation of life unfolding gently before one's eyes. A soft breeze swept across the valley, carrying with it whispers of distant waters and subtle fragrances of hidden blossoms. Morty tilted his face into the wind, letting it brush against his skin and settle into his chest. He felt a warmth that was not urgent or loud, but steady and reassuring, the kind that comes from being seen and accompanied without expectation. Rick's quiet presence beside him offered the same assurance. Morty realized that companionship, when calm and attentive, could be one of the most grounding forces in a world filled with unpredictability. They arrived at a small wooden bridge arching gently over the stream. Morty stepped onto it, feeling the faint sway beneath his feet, and gazed down at the water, noting the subtle reflections of clouds and stars merging with the current. Rick crouched beside him, his eyes tracing the same patterns, and for a moment the two of them simply existed there together, neither speaking nor moving beyond the gentle rhythm of the world. Morty felt an almost sacred quiet settle over him, the understanding that some adventures were measured not by excitement or danger, but by presence, patience, and shared observation. Evening approached slowly, and the sky shifted into muted purples and silvers, dotted faintly with emerging stars. Morty leaned against the bridge railing, feeling the coolness of the wood and the gentle sway beneath him. Rick remained standing nearby, observing both Morty and the soft glimmering of the stream below. Morty realized that the most enduring journeys were often the quietest ones, the ones that required noticing, breathing, and allowing the world to unfold without interference. Morty spoke softly, almost to himself. "Do you think the world remembers these small moments?" Rick considered for a long moment, then said quietly, "Not in the way you might imagine. But it remembers attention, presence, the care we take to notice. That's what lingers." Morty absorbed the words, letting them settle deeply into his chest. He understood that significance was not always measured in action, chaos, or noise. It could exist quietly in the mindful observation and shared presence that often went unnoticed by the world. Night fully descended, and the valley seemed to breathe along with them. Morty closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sound of water, wind, and distant rustle of leaves envelop him completely. He felt a rare peace, a calm certainty that he was exactly where he needed to be, and that the presence of Rick beside him reinforced that quiet understanding. Rick's steady silence became a grounding energy, a reminder that companionship could be as powerful and sustaining as any chaotic adventure or extraordinary feat. Finally, Rick extended a hand to Morty, helping him rise from the bridge. They continued walking along the valley path, the stars above shimmering faintly, their light mirrored in the rippling water below. Morty's steps were careful, deliberate, carrying the lessons of the day, patience, observation, and the quiet reassurance of companionship. The valley seemed to hum softly in approval, the gentle pulse of the landscape echoing the rhythm of their footsteps and the subtle warmth of their shared presence. And as they moved side by side into the unfolding night, Morty felt a warmth spread through him, a quiet understanding that the most extraordinary journeys often occur in stillness, in observation, and in shared presence. Even in strange, unpredictable worlds, there could be softness, attention, and gentle wonder. And with that they continued, walking slowly into the unknown, carrying the quiet rhythm of the valley, the subtle lessons of mindful observation, and the enduring warmth of companionship into the night ahead. The morning began softly, a gentle light, spilling across a valley dotted with wildflowers, their colors muted yet vivid against the soft green of the grass. Rick and Morty walked along a narrow path, each step deliberate, letting the ground beneath their feet absorb their presence and leave a faint trace. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and distant blossoms, mingled with a subtle warmth that seemed to settle quietly into the chest. Morty inhaled slowly, noticing the way his own heartbeat matched the gentle rhythm of the world around him. Rick walked beside him, quiet and steady, offering a presence that was grounding without a word. They approached a grove of ancient trees, their trunks thick and knotted, their leaves whispering softly in the breeze. Morty ran his fingers along the rough bark, feeling the life pulsing within the wood, slow and steady, enduring across time. Rick remained beside him, silent, observing Morty more than the grove itself. Morty felt a warmth in that quiet attention, an unspoken acknowledgement of the care he took to notice the small, subtle details of the world. This understanding, shared without words, felt more important than any adventure or discovery he had ever experienced. A shallow stream ran through the grove, its water clear and whispering as it moved over smooth stones. Morty knelt beside it, letting his fingers trace the current, watching the light bend and shimmer across the surface. He caught glimpses of himself reflected and refracted in ways that seemed to show not just who he was, but who he might become. Calmer, steadier, aware of subtleties he had once overlooked. Rick crouched beside him, his gaze on both the stream and Morty, and for a moment they existed together in quiet equilibrium. Morty felt a subtle sense of growth, unspoken yet undeniable. They followed the stream deeper into the grove, stepping over roots and patches of soft moss, each step a careful negotiation with the gentle terrain. Flowers leaned toward the water's edge, glimmering faintly as if acknowledging their passage. Morty paused, watching a particularly delicate bloom, and resisted the urge to touch it. There was a quiet lesson in observation without interference, in letting beauty exist for its own sake. Rick walked beside him, silent but present, conveying understanding without a single word. Morty felt the lesson settle inside him, warm and grounding. As the sun climbed higher, the grove shifted subtly with light and shadow. Patterns on the ground formed fleeting shapes that suggested stories and memories if one had patience to notice. Morty observed them, feeling a quiet connection to the world around him. He realized that some of the most profound journeys were not marked by movement or chaos, but by attentive presence, by the slow and deliberate act of noticing and appreciating the small wonders often overlooked. Rick's quiet observation beside him reinforced that understanding, showing that companionship could be as meaningful as discovery. A soft breeze stirred, carrying scents of flowers, moss, and something older, a memory of wind moving through these trees long before either of them had arrived. Morty tilted his face into the wind, letting it brush his skin, feeling its warmth and softness settle into his chest. Rick remained beside him, calm and steady, a grounding presence that reinforced the sense of peace and patience the grove offered. Morty felt the rare comfort of shared understanding, of knowing that someone else could witness and honor the quiet rhythms of life without rushing or demanding. They reached a small wooden bridge arching gently over the stream. Morty stepped onto it, feeling the subtle sway beneath his feet. He looked down at the water, noting the faint reflections of leaves and sky mingling in the current. Rick crouched beside him, studying the movement of the water with careful attention. For a long moment, neither spoke, both simply present in the quiet rhythm of the grove and the soft movement of the stream. Morty felt the importance of these unspoken moments, of quiet companionship, of shared observation, and it resonated deeply within him. Evening approached, soft and unhurried. The grove was bathed in muted purples and golds, the light shifting gently across leaves, stones, and water. Shadows stretched long and curling across the path, forming subtle patterns that suggested hidden stories. Morty exhaled slowly, letting the calm settle into him. He realized that adventure was not always in chaos or excitement. Sometimes it existed in the patient observation of life, in noticing the delicate details and rhythms that others overlooked. Rick's presence beside him offered quiet confirmation that this understanding mattered. Morty spoke softly, almost to himself. "Do you think the world remembers these quiet moments?" Rick paused, considering before answering. "Not exactly, but it remembers presence, attention, and the care we take to notice. That's the kind of imprint that lasts." Morty absorbed the words, feeling them sink into his chest. He understood that significance was not measured by action or chaos, but by mindful awareness, patient observation, and shared presence, even if unnoticed by the wider world. Night fell fully, the grove alive with faint whispers of wind and water. Morty closed his eyes, letting the subtle hum of life surround him. He felt a rare serenity, a calm certainty that he was exactly where he needed to be. Rick remained beside him, silent yet reassuring, a reminder that companionship could provide as much comfort and guidance as any chaos-driven adventure. Morty understood that shared presence and quiet observation were among the most enduring gifts one could experience. Finally, Rick extended a hand to Morty, helping him rise from the edge of the stream. They continued along the path, the stars beginning to twinkle faintly overhead. Morty's steps were deliberate, each carrying the lessons of the day, patience, observation, and the quiet assurance of companionship. The grove seemed to exhale softly around them, the gentle rhythm of leaves, water, and wind echoing the subtle pulse of their shared presence. And as they moved side by side into the night, Morty felt warmth spread through his chest, a quiet understanding that the most extraordinary journeys were often the quietest, unfolding in stillness, careful attention, and shared presence. Even in worlds filled with unpredictability, there could be softness, awareness, and gentle wonder. And with that they continued walking, slowly and deliberately, carrying the quiet rhythm of the grove, the subtle lessons of mindful observation, and the enduring warmth of companionship into the night ahead. Morning arrived with a gentle, amber light, spilling across a quiet plateau where the wind moved softly through tall, golden grasses. Rick and Morty stepped onto the open field, their footsteps sinking slightly into the soft earth. The air was warm, yet tempered with a faint coolness, carrying the smell of sun-warmed soil and distant flowers. Morty inhaled deeply, letting the scent fill him, noticing the subtle pulse of life in the grass as it swayed around him. Rick walked beside him, hands tucked casually into his pockets, his presence steady and quietly reassuring. The plateau stretched endlessly, dotted with smooth stones and scattered wildflowers that leaned toward the sun. Morty bent down to observe one, its petals delicate and quivering slightly in the breeze. He let it exist undisturbed, appreciating the quiet perfection of its form. Rick walked beside him, silent, allowing Morty the space to notice and absorb the subtle beauty around them. Morty felt warmth in his chest, a gentle reassurance that the act of mindful observation was itself a form of understanding. A small stream trickled across the plateau, winding lazily between stones and tufts of grass. Morty knelt beside it, dipping his fingers into the cool water. Ripples spread gently, catching the sunlight and reflecting tiny, dancing fragments of gold. For a moment Morty thought he saw echoes of himself reflected not just as he was, but as he might become. Calmer, more patient, attuned to the quiet pulses of the world. Rick crouched beside him, his gaze on the water, subtle acknowledgement passing between them without a word. They followed the stream as it wound through the plateau, stepping carefully over smooth stones and soft patches of moss. Flowers glimmered faintly along the edges, catching the light and bending gently toward the passing wind. Morty paused, taking in their quiet shimmer. He realized that observation itself was a form of participation, that noticing with care could be as impactful as action. Rick's steady presence beside him reinforced the lesson without speaking a single word. The sun climbed higher, and the plateau shifted in color and shadow. Morty observed the subtle patterns of light stretching across the grass, the way each blade moved with the breeze. He felt a connection to the rhythm of the land, understanding that the world moved in pulses, soft yet insistent, carrying lessons for those who paid attention. Rick's silence beside him made the lesson feel safe, grounding, as though shared presence amplified understanding. A breeze stirred, carrying the faint scent of distant waters and flowers. Morty let it brush across his face, feeling it settle into his chest with a comforting warmth. Rick remained nearby, calm and steady, offering quiet companionship that made the world feel both larger and safer. Morty realized that shared attention, calm presence, and patient observation were as vital as any tool or skill he had encountered in their journeys. They reached a small, ancient grove of trees at the edge of the plateau, their trunks wide and rough, bark textured with age and resilience. Morty ran his hand along one trunk, feeling the life pulsing slowly within it. Rick walked beside him, silent, observing Morty's interaction with the trees. Morty felt the warmth of acknowledgement, a quiet approval that reinforced the significance of careful observation and gentle engagement with the world. Evening approached, soft and unhurried, turning the sky into muted shades of violet and silver. Shadows stretched long across the plateau, curling around stones, flowers, and tufts of grass in intricate, ever-changing patterns. Morty exhaled slowly, letting the calm settle deeply within him. He realized that some of the most profound journeys were not measured by distance, danger, or chaos, but by the deliberate act of noticing and being present in the world's subtle rhythms. A gentle wind stirred, carrying whispers of distant trees and flowing waters. Morty closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sounds, scents, and faint warmth wrap around him like a soft blanket. Rick remained beside him, silent yet grounding, offering assurance that he was not alone in this quiet journey. Morty felt a rare serenity, a calm certainty that being present, mindful, and attentive was itself a form of progress, of growth. They approached a small wooden bridge arching over a widening portion of the stream. Morty stepped onto it carefully, feeling the subtle sway beneath his feet, and looked down at the water below. Light shimmered across the surface, forming soft patterns that twisted and shifted with the current. Rick crouched beside him, observing both Morty and the gentle flow of the water. For a long moment, neither spoke. Morty felt the importance of these unspoken moments, of silent companionship, and of shared attention to the delicate details of the world. Night began to fall, the sky deepening into shades of indigo and silver. The first stars appeared faintly, mirrored in the rippling stream below. Morty leaned against the bridge railing, feeling the cool wood beneath his hands and letting the gentle sway ground him. Rick stood nearby, still and observant, reinforcing the quiet sense of safety and presence that filled the plateau. Morty understood that some journeys were measured not by speed or achievement, but by awareness, attention, and the soft, enduring rhythm of shared experience. Morty spoke softly, almost to himself. "Do you think the world remembers these quiet moments?" Rick paused, considering before replying. not exactly. It remembers attention, presence, and the care we take to notice. That's what lasts. Morty absorbed the words, letting them settle deeply into his chest. He realized that significance was not always loud or chaotic. It could exist quietly in mindful observation and shared presence, leaving a subtle yet enduring imprint. Finally, Rick extended a hand to Morty, helping him rise from the bridge. Together they walked along the plateau, the stars now twinkling faintly above. Morty's steps were careful and deliberate, carrying the lessons of the day, patience, mindful observation, and the quiet reassurance of companionship. The plateau seemed to hum softly in response, echoing the gentle rhythm of their shared presence and the subtle warmth of being fully attentive to the world. And as they moved side by side into the unfolding night, Morty felt a warmth spread through him, a quiet understanding that the most extraordinary journeys often unfolded in stillness, in careful observation, and in shared presence. Even in unpredictable worlds there could be softness, awareness, and gentle wonder. And with that they continued walking slowly into the unknown, carrying the quiet rhythm of the plateau, the subtle lessons of mindful attention, and the enduring warmth of companionship into the night ahead. The morning unfolded like a soft sigh, a gentle gold spilling across a valley where the wind moved lazily through tall grasses. Rick and Morty walked slowly along a narrow path, the earth beneath their feet soft and yielding, carrying the faint scent of dew and distant blooms. Morty inhaled deeply, feeling the air settle gently in his chest, each breath carrying a quiet sense of presence. Rick moved beside him, steady and calm, his presence comforting without the need for words. They reached a small grove of trees whose branches arched gracefully, their leaves whispering softly in the morning breeze. Morty ran his hand along the bark of one ancient trunk, feeling the subtle pulse of life within it. He paused, listening to the gentle rustle of leaves and the distant hum of water, aware of the steady rhythm of the grove. Rick remained beside him, observing both Morty and the grove, silent yet attentive, offering quiet reassurance in the shared presence. Morty felt a warmth settle inside him, a deep sense of calm and understanding. A shallow stream cut through the grove, its water clear and flowing, with a gentle murmur that echoed softly in the stillness. Morty knelt beside it, dipping his fingers into the cool current. Ripples spread outward, catching the morning light and scattering it in delicate, dancing fragments. He watched closely, and for a fleeting moment he thought he glimpsed not just himself, but echoes of his future, more patient, more aware, attuned to the subtle pulses of the world. Rick crouched beside him, quiet, letting Morty explore the moment fully without interruption. They followed the stream as it wound through the grove, stepping over roots and patches of moss. Along the banks, flowers leaned toward the water, glimmering faintly with subtle light. Morty paused, admiring a bloom whose petals quivered softly in the breeze. He resisted touching it, letting it remain perfect and unaltered. Rick walked beside him, silent, and Morty realized that the most profound lessons often existed in restraint, in observation, in allowing beauty to exist undisturbed. The grove seemed to affirm this, its quiet presence embracing the careful attention. As the sun climbed higher, the grove's light shifted subtly, casting long, curling shadows that twisted across the soft earth. Morty observed them, noting how a single change in angle or movement transformed the entire pattern. He felt a deep connection to the rhythm of life around him, a soft awareness of how every element influenced another. Rick's calm presence beside him reinforced this understanding, showing that companionship could quietly enhance the depth of perception without a single word. A gentle breeze passed through, carrying the faint scent of distant waters and blossoms, mixing with the warm earth, beneath their feet. Morty tilted his face into the wind, letting it brush his skin and settle into his chest with comforting warmth. Rick remained close, a quiet anchor, his presence making the world feel larger, softer, and safer. Morty understood that the greatest lessons often came not from action, but from mindful attention and shared stillness. They reached a small wooden bridge that arched gently over the stream. Morty stepped carefully onto it, feeling the subtle sway beneath his feet. He gazed down at the water, watching the reflection of clouds and leaves, twisted and shimmering in soft currents. Rick crouched beside him, observing both Morty and the gentle movement of the water. For a long moment, neither spoke, sharing the rhythm of the grove and the quiet music of flowing water. Morty felt the profound value of these unspoken moments, of silent companionship and the attentive observation of life's delicate details. Evening approached, muted and soft. The grove was bathed in shades of violet and gold, the light shifting gently across leaves, stones, and water. Shadows stretched long across the path, curling in intricate, ever-changing shapes. Morty exhaled slowly, letting the quiet soak into his chest. He realized that some of the most meaningful journeys were not measured by movement, chaos, or action, but by presence, careful observation, and the patient appreciation of subtle details. Rick's silent companionship validated the importance of these lessons. A faint wind carried whispers of distant trees, flowing waters, and hidden blooms. Morty closed his eyes for a moment, letting the soft sounds envelop him completely. He felt a rare serenity, a calm certainty that he was exactly where he needed to be. Rick remained beside him, quiet yet grounding, reinforcing the sense of safety and presence. Morty realized that shared attention and careful observation were among the most enduring and rewarding experiences he could have. Morty spoke softly, almost to himself. "Do you think the world remembers these quiet moments?" Rick considered for a long moment before replying, "Not exactly, but it remembers attention, presence, and the care we take to notice. That is what lasts." Morty absorbed the words, feeling them settle gently into his chest. He understood that significance was not always in loud action or chaos, but could exist quietly, subtly, in mindful observation and shared presence, leaving a lasting impression in the quiet fabric of the world. Night descended fully, the grove alive with soft rustling of leaves, distant murmurs of water, and faint glimmers of stars above. Morty leaned against the bridge railing, feeling the wood's cool surface and the gentle sway beneath him. Rick stood nearby, still and attentive, grounding the moment with his quiet presence. Morty understood that some journeys were measured not by adventure or chaos, but by the deliberate, patient act of noticing and being fully present in the rhythm of the world. Finally, Rick extended his hand to Morty, helping him rise from the edge of the stream. Together they continued along the grove's path, the stars beginning to shimmer faintly in the night sky. Morty's steps were deliberate, carrying the lessons of the day, patience, observation, and the quiet reassurance of companionship. The grove seemed to breathe softly around them, echoing the gentle pulse of their shared presence and the warmth of mindful awareness. And as they walked side by side into the unfolding night, Morty felt a warmth spread through him, a quiet understanding that the most profound journeys often occur in stillness, in careful observation, and in shared presence. Even in unpredictable worlds there could be softness, awareness, and gentle wonder. And with that they continued, moving slowly and deliberately into the unknown, carrying the quiet rhythm of the grove, the subtle lessons of mindfulness, and the enduring warmth of companionship into the night ahead. The night, stretched wide and endless above them, a velvet canvas scattered with soft glimmers of distant stars. Rick and Morty walked quietly along the winding path that led them out of the grove, their footsteps muted by the moss and fallen leaves that blanketed the ground. Morty tilted his head back, watching the constellations drift slowly across the heavens. There was something calming about the slow arc of the stars, their patient journey through time, as if they whispered of stories far older than either of them could imagine. The air was cooler now, carrying with it a faint hint of damp earth and far-off blossoms. Morty inhaled deeply, letting the freshness sink into him, a gentle reminder that the world could feel alive even in the quietest of hours. Rick remained beside him, his pace steady, his hands tucked into his coat pockets. He didn't need to speak, his presence was enough, grounding Morty in a way that words never could. Together they walked, two figures moving through a night alive with hidden songs. They soon came upon a clearing where the moonlight spilled like silver across the grass, each blade shimmering with dew. Morty paused at the edge, staring at the gentle glow that seemed to pool on the ground like liquid light. He stepped forward slowly, feeling the coolness of the grass beneath his shoes, each step sending ripples of dew scattering in the pale glow. Rick joined him, standing quietly, his gaze lifted toward the sky. The clearing felt like a cathedral made not of stone, but of silence and open air, a place where even the faintest breath seemed sacred. In the center of the clearing stood a single stone, smooth and weathered by years of wind and rain. Moss clung to its base, and faint carvings etched its surface, though they had long since faded into obscurity. Morty ran his fingers across the cool surface, tracing the worn grooves, wondering what stories the stone once held. Rick crouched beside him, brushing away a patch of moss, his eyes narrowing as if trying to decipher some lost message. But in the end, he gave a soft chuckle and shook his head. "Some things aren't meant to be remembered in detail," he murmured. "They're meant to be felt." Morty lingered by the stone, sensing that truth in his words. The faint carvings, though unreadable, still carried weight. They were fragments of memory, traces of lives and moments that had passed, yet they remained. He realized that perhaps the importance of such things wasn't in understanding them completely, but in acknowledging their quiet persistence. The stone, weathered and silent, was a reminder that presence itself could be enough. A breeze moved through the clearing, stirring the grasses in gentle waves. The sound was soft, almost like the murmur of a distant sea. Morty closed his eyes, listening intently, and for a moment he imagined he was standing at the edge of a great ocean, the tide rolling in and out with patient rhythm. The sensation filled him with a deep calm, as if he were a small part of something vast yet welcoming. Rick stood beside him, saying nothing, but Morty could feel his awareness, his quiet observation of the same gentle rhythm. As the night deepened, the clearing grew softer, shadows stretching long and silver light dancing faintly across the leaves. Fireflies emerged, their tiny bodies flickering with warm golden light, drifting lazily through the air. Morty watched them with wonder, his eyes following their erratic yet graceful movements. Each flicker felt like a heartbeat, a reminder of the small, fleeting lives that carried beauty all their own. Rick's gaze softened as he watched too, and for a brief moment, Morty thought he saw a hint of tenderness in the old man's eyes. They sat together in the clearing, settling onto the cool grass. Morty lay back, staring at the sky, while Rick remained seated, one knee bent, his silhouette outlined by the pale moonlight. Silence stretched comfortably between them, broken only by the whisper of wind and the distant call of a night bird. Morty thought of how rare such moments were. Moments where the world felt neither overwhelming nor chaotic, but simply present, steady, and alive. After a long silence, Morty spoke softly, his voice little more than a whisper. "Do you think we ever really leave something behind? Or do all the little pieces of us stay like the carvings on that stone?" Rick didn't answer immediately. He leaned back, exhaling slowly, his gaze fixed on the stars. Finally, he said, "We leave traces, Morty. Not always clear, not always permanent, but they're there. In memory, in places, in the people we pass by. Most of it fades, sure, but not all, never all." The words sank deep into Morty's chest, settling there like roots. He thought of the stone again, of the carvings worn nearly smooth yet still faintly visible. He thought of fireflies flickering briefly, their light fading but never forgotten in the moment it existed. And he thought of himself and Rick, walking quietly beneath the vast sky, leaving behind footprints in grass that would vanish by morning, yet still having been there, still having mattered in their own quiet way. The hours slipped by unnoticed. The clearing seemed suspended in its own gentle rhythm, neither hurried nor delayed. Eventually Rick rose to his feet, brushing dew from his coat. He extended a hand to Morty, pulling him up from the grass. Morty took one last look at the stone, the fireflies, and the moonlit field. Then, with quiet acceptance, he turned and followed Rick as they left the clearing behind, stepping once more onto the winding path. The forest welcomed them again, shadows curling like soft veils around the trees. The stream they had followed earlier murmured faintly in the distance, its steady rhythm guiding them onward. Morty felt no need to hurry, no urge to rush. He understood now that the journey was not about reaching the end, but about each small presence. Along the way, the stone, the fireflies, the whispers of wind. As the path stretched before them, Morty's eyelids grew heavy, the quiet of the night wrapping around him like a blanket. The stars above blurred softly, and he felt himself drifting into a state between waking and dreaming. Rick noticed, but said nothing, simply adjusting his pace to match Morty's slowing steps. Together they moved forward, carrying with them the gentle weight of the clearing, the silver light of the moon, and the soft hum of the world's quiet song. And as the forest deepened around them, Morty realized with a peaceful certainty that even if everything faded in time, even if every mark softened like the stone's carvings, the presence of these moments, the quiet, the companionship, the awareness, would remain within him, etched not in stone, but in memory where it mattered most. The forest path curved gently downward, leading Rick and Morty toward the sound of moving water. The murmur had been faint before, like a dream, too quiet to remember, but now it grew clearer, steady and low, carrying a rhythm that seemed older than the trees themselves. Morty's steps slowed as he listened, letting the sound guide his breath, sinking his chest to the pulse of the unseen river. Rick walked just ahead, his silhouette framed by the faint shimmer of moonlight breaking through the canopy. When they emerged from the trees, the sight of the river opened before them like an unfolding story. It moved broad and slow, its surface shimmering with silver where the moonlight touched it, while the deeper water rolled dark and quiet. The air here was cool, carrying the faint scent of minerals and moss, and the constant hush of water moving over unseen stones. Morty stood at the riverbank, his gaze tracing the way the current stretched far into the distance, both directions fading into shadow and mist. He crouched and touched the water with tentative fingers. It was colder than he expected, sharp yet refreshing, and as the ripples spread outward, they bent the moon's reflection into wavering shapes. Rick watched him silently, then lowered himself onto a fallen log nearby, his coat rustling as he settled in. He pulled from his pocket a small flask, unscrewing the cap, but only holding it loosely, as if uncertain whether to drink. His eyes stayed fixed on the water, the way it kept moving forward, never pausing, never looking back. Morty sat beside him, knees pulled to his chest. For a while, they said nothing. The river spoke for them, its steady voice filling the silence. The sound was not loud, but it was constant, a reminder that even when the world stilled, there was always movement somewhere, always a current carrying time along. Morty found himself hypnotized by it, his eyes following the ripples until they blurred into something like the slow drift of thought. After a long while, Morty broke the silence. Do you think the river remembers every drop that's passed through it? Or does it just keep going, forgetting everything behind it? Rick tilted the flask in his hands, the moonlight glinting off the metal. His voice was low, almost a murmur. It doesn't remember, Morty, but it leaves marks. On the stones, on the banks, on anything it touches. Maybe that's enough. Maybe memory doesn't belong to the water. It belongs to what it changes. Morty turned this over in his mind, watching the way the current shaped the banks, the way bits of driftwood and leaves rode the surface before vanishing around a bend. He thought of himself, of all the days that had carried him forward, sometimes gently, sometimes violently, and he wondered what kind of marks had been left behind in his own passing. The night deepened around them. A fog began to rise from the river, pale and faint, curling across the surface in shifting trails. It softened the world, blurring the far bank until it seemed like the river flowed into nothingness. Fireflies glimmered here and there above the reeds, their golden light brief and flickering, like sparks drifting from an unseen fire. Morty leaned back on his hands, feeling the damp grass beneath his palms, and let his gaze drift upward to the sky. The stars seemed fewer here, as though the mist had dimmed them, but the ones that remained burned with a quiet determination. Rick finally took a sip from the flask, but it was small, almost hesitant. He closed it again, slipping it back into his pocket, and exhaled slowly, his breath fogging faintly in the cool air. Morty glanced at him, noticing the weariness etched into his profile, the way his shoulders hunched slightly, as though carrying a weight too old to put down. Yet there was also something softer about him in this moment, something unguarded. You ever feel like you're just drifting? Morty asked quietly. Rick gave a dry laugh, though it wasn't sharp, more like an old echo. All the time, Morty, that's life. You drift. Sometimes you fight the current. Sometimes you let it carry you. Either way, it takes you somewhere. Morty nodded, eyes lowering back to the water. The river's endless flow felt like a mirror of what Rick was saying, neither resisting nor rushing, simply moving, patient and certain. Morty let himself breathe with it, each inhale matching the imagined pull of the current, each exhale releasing into its steady rhythm. His thoughts slowed, softened, until they felt as fluid as the water itself. After a time, Rick stood, brushing grass from his coat. He stretched briefly, then looked down at Morty. We should keep moving. Nights don't last forever. His voice held no urgency, though it was more of an invitation than a command. Morty rose reluctantly, casting one last glance at the river. The mist seemed to shimmer faintly as he looked, as if acknowledging his presence before slowly reclaiming the stillness. He followed Rick back toward the path, their footsteps quiet on the damp ground. The river remained behind them, its voice fading but not vanishing, lingering like a song half remembered. The trail wound upward now, carrying them away from the water. The sound of the current grew softer with each step, replaced by the rustle of leaves and the occasional hoot of an unseen owl. Morty felt the river's rhythm still inside him, steadying his breath as they climbed. Rick walked just ahead, his pace unhurried but sure, his figure a dark outline against the faint silver sky. When they reached the crest of a hill, Morty paused to look back. Through the trees he caught glimpses of the river shining faintly in the distance, a ribbon of light threading through the valley. It felt far away already, yet its presence lingered in him, as though he had taken a piece of it with him. He smiled faintly to himself before turning to follow Rick again. The forest on this side of the hill was quieter, deeper, the trees taller and more closely woven. Shadows gathered thick beneath their branches, yet the path remained clear, as though guiding them forward with gentle certainty. Morty felt the weight of sleep pressing softly at the edges of his mind, his steps growing slower. But he didn't resist. The night was a cradle now, and he let it hold him. Rick glanced back once, noticing Morty's heavy eyes. He didn't speak, only adjusted his pace so the boy could keep close. Together they moved into the deeper woods, their figures swallowed gradually by shadow and mist, the river's memory still flowing quietly within them. And though the sound had faded, Morty carried with him a truth as steady as the current, that to drift was not always to be lost, but sometimes simply to move, to be carried, to continue, leaving traces in places unseen, just as the river carved its story into stone. The forest deepened around them, its branches weaving together so thickly that only strands of moonlight slipped through, silver threads falling upon moss and root. The air here was different, heavy with dampness, as though the night itself had thickened into something tangible. Rick and Morty walked in silence, their footsteps softened by layers of fallen leaves, the path winding forward with a quiet insistence. Morty's eyes traced the shapes of the trees, their trunks rising like pillars into the dark canopy above. Some leaned at impossible angles, roots clutching the soil like ancient hands, while others stretched perfectly straight, their bark scarred with the long history of storms. The silence between them was vast, but not empty. It held the slow rhythm of their steps, the faint whisper of leaves shifting high overhead, and the quiet pulse of the night itself. They passed beneath an arch formed by two leaning trees, their branches fused together as though clasped in an eternal embrace. Morty slowed, touching the rough bark as he went. "It feels like there." "Holding each other up," he whispered, almost to himself. Rick glanced back briefly, his expression unreadable, though his eyes lingered on the arch for a moment before turning away again. Or maybe one leaned too far and the other just never got the chance to move, he muttered. His voice wasn't bitter, just reflective, like a thought that had long ago settled into the rhythm of his mind. Morty followed, his thoughts tugged by the idea. Sometimes strength looked like holding, sometimes like leaning, and sometimes like both at once. The arch of the trees remained behind them, a silent reminder that survival often came in pairs, in bonds unseen yet unbroken. As the path wound onward, the forest floor began to glow faintly. Small fungi clung to the bases of trees and the fallen logs, emitting a soft, pale light that painted the ground in shades of blue and green. Morty crouched to look closer, fascinated by the gentle illumination. The glow was steady, patient, as though the forest itself carried its own hidden stars beneath the soil. Rick stopped as well, his gaze drifting across the scattered lights. "Bioluminescence," he murmured. "Tiny organisms surviving by shining in the dark. Funny, isn't it? The darker it gets, the brighter they appear." Morty smiled faintly, brushing his fingers near the glow without touching. "It feels peaceful, like the forest is alive in its own quiet way." Rick said nothing, but his eyes softened briefly before he turned and kept walking. Morty rose and followed, the glowing trail stretching out behind them like a constellation spread across the earth. The deeper they went, the more the forest seemed to change. The trees grew older, their trunks thicker, their roots twisting across the path like the bones of the earth. Mist clung to the air here, low and swirling, catching the glow of the fungi until it seemed the ground itself was breathing. Morty found his steps slowing, each movement careful, as though he were walking through a dream. At last they reached a clearing. In its center stood a single tree, massive and solitary, its branches stretching wide and high, crowned with leaves that shimmered faintly in the moonlight. Its roots spread outward like a vast web, breaking the earth and sinking deep again, their reach nearly encircling the entire clearing. Morty stopped, staring up at it. "It's huge," he breathed, his voice hushed by awe. Rick stood beside him, hands in his pockets, his gaze steady. "It's old," he replied quietly. "Older than us, older than most things you'll ever see. A witness tree, been here long enough to see the world change around it, and still it stands." Morty felt small before it, yet not in a frightening way. More like standing before a grandfather he had never met, one who carried centuries of stories in silence. He stepped closer, laying his hand against the bark. It was rough and ridged, but warm, as though it carried its own quiet pulse. Rick watched him, then spoke, softly, almost to himself. "Trees like this. They don't
Move, Morty! They don't run, they endure. The storms come, the seasons shift, everything around them falls away, but they stay. They remember." Morty turned, frowning slightly. "But you said the river doesn't remember." Rick gave a dry chuckle, shaking his head. "That's because rivers are always moving. Trees, they stay. They carry their scars in the rings of their trunks. Every year, a record. Every year, a story." Morty let the words sink in as he pressed his palm more firmly against the bark. He imagined the rings hidden deep within, countless circles carved by time, each one holding a piece of the tree's long memory. It comforted him, the thought that something could live so long and still keep standing. They sat at the base of the great tree, leaning back against its vast trunk. The bark was firm against their backs, yet grounding, steady. The clearing was quiet except for the faint rustle of leaves above and the soft hum of night insects in the grass. Morty let his head rest against the tree, his eyes half closing as he breathed in the scent of wood and earth. "Do you think people can be like trees?" he asked, drowsily. Rick exhaled slowly, his gaze fixed on the sky above the branches. "Some try, most can't. We're not built to stay in one place forever. But maybe, in the marks we leave on each other, in the roots we put down for a little while, maybe that's close enough." Morty thought about that, his mind drifting like a leaf on the current of Rick's words. He didn't answer, but his silence carried meaning, and Rick didn't press further. Together they remained beneath the great tree, two small figures resting against something far older than their own stories. As the night deepened, Morty's eyes finally closed, his breathing soft and steady. Rick stayed awake longer, his gaze tracing the silhouette of the branches against the star-streaked sky. He reached into his pocket, pulling out the flask again, but this time he didn't open it. Instead, he set it down beside him, the cool metal pressing into the roots. For a moment, his hand lingered on the bark, fingers brushing the ancient surface. "Endure," he whispered, so softly that only the tree could hear. The night held them in its stillness, the great tree standing silent, patient, eternal.
The forest seemed to breathe around them, the glow of the fungi shimmering faintly in the mist, as though the earth itself was dreaming. And there, beneath the oldest witness of the woods, Rick and Morty found a quiet pause in their journey, a moment of rest not taken from the world, but given to them by it, a moment as steady and enduring as the tree itself. The dawn did not come quickly. It seeped into the forest like water, filling cracks in stone, slow and deliberate, until the blackness of night softened into grey. Rick stirred first, his eyes opening to the faint wash of light across the clearing. He remained still for a while, his back pressed to the trunk of the ancient tree, watching as the outlines of branches sharpened against the sky. Beside him, Morty shifted in his sleep, his head resting awkwardly against his arm. A soft sound escaped his throat, not quite a word, not quite a sigh, something between dreaming and waking. Rick glanced at him briefly, then away, as if acknowledging the boy's sleep without disturbing it. The air was cool, heavy with the scent of damp soil and bark. Each breath felt crisp, carrying the faint tang of dew clinging to leaves. The forest, once mysterious and alive with shadows, now revealed its stillness. The fungi that had glowed in the night dimmed to dull grey patches, retreating from the dawn as though sleep belonged to them too. When Morty finally opened his eyes, he blinked against the pale light filtering through the canopy. "It's morning already?" His voice was thick with sleep, his words slow. "Yeah," Rick said simply, pushing himself to his feet. His joints cracked faintly in the quiet, but he didn't grimace. He brushed the dirt from his coat, then looked toward the path leading out of the clearing. "We've got ground to cover." Morty rose more reluctantly, stretching his arms with a soft groan. He glanced back at the great tree, its presence unchanged, steady and immense. For a fleeting moment he wished they could stay longer, resting in the safety of its roots. But the path always pulled forward, and the world never stayed still. They left the clearing without words, their steps light upon the dew-slick ground. The forest around them seemed gentler now, its edges softened by morning. Birds stirred in the canopy, their calls breaking the silence with sudden bursts of song. Morty tilted his head back, listening, surprised at how alive the woods felt with light awake. The path wound upward, narrowing as it rose. Roots cut across the trail, slick with moisture, forcing them to step carefully. Morty stumbled once, catching himself on a branch, his breath quick. Rick didn't look back, though his voice carried over his shoulder. "Watch your footing! The forest doesn't care how clumsy you are." Morty muttered under his breath, but kept climbing. His legs ached with the incline, but he pressed forward, his eyes fixed on the light brightening between the trees. And then suddenly the path opened. They emerged onto a ridge, the forest falling away below them in rolling waves of green and mist. The horizon stretched wide, painted with the pale gold of dawn. Valleys slumbered beneath drifting veils of fog, and distant peaks rose sharp against the sky. Morty stopped, breath caught in his chest. "Whoa!" The words slipped out unbidden, too small for the sight before him. Rick stood beside him, his expression unreadable. He pulled a flask from his pocket, weighed it in his hand, then slid it back without drinking. "World's bigger than it looks from the ground," he said quietly. Morty nodded, his eyes still fixed on the horizon. "It feels like everything's connected. The trees, the valleys, even the sky, like it's all part of one huge thing." Rick's gaze lingered on him, then returned to the view. "Maybe, or maybe it's just a bunch of pieces that happen to fit together for now. Doesn't matter either way. You're standing in the middle of it. That's enough." The ridge was narrow, the ground sloping sharply on either side, but they walked along it slowly, the world stretching endlessly around them. Morty's heart thudded with both awe and unease, the height making his steps careful. Yet the vastness of it all filled him with something steadier than fear. It was humbling, almost comforting, to be so small in such an endless expanse. They stopped at a flat stone outcrop, its surface warmed faintly by the rising sun. Rick sat first, his back hunched, his gaze fixed outward. Morty followed, crossing his legs, his hands resting on his knees. The silence between them was deep, but not heavy. It felt like the world itself was holding its breath, waiting. Morty broke it softly. "Do you think we'll remember this, like years from now?" Rick didn't look at him. "You will. I'll probably forget." His tone was blunt, but not cruel. It carried a weary honesty, like someone too accustomed to watching moments slip away. Morty frowned slightly, turning the words over. "But if one of us remembers, then it still matters, right?" Rick finally glanced at him, a shadow of something unreadable passing across his face. "Yeah, Morty, it matters." The sun climbed higher, spilling gold across the ridge, chasing away the mist in the valleys below. The world seemed to awaken piece by piece, the rustle of wind through leaves, the cries of distant birds, the faint hum of life stirring unseen. Morty closed his eyes, letting the warmth of the sun rest on his face, his breathing slow and steady. For that moment, the journey did not press forward, and the world did not demand anything of them. There was only the ridge, the vast horizon, and the fragile truth that some moments linger, no matter how far they are carried by time. And beneath the rising sun, Rick and Morty sat quietly together, two small figures perched upon the edge of something greater than themselves, held not by answers, but by the stillness of the morning, by the quiet fact of being here, alive, together, in the widening light. The ridge fell away behind them as the day stretched forward, and the forest swallowed them once more. The light was different now, sharper and more direct, yet softened by the canopy above. Leaves glowed in shifting shades of green as the breeze moved through them, scattering patches of brightness across the ground. Rick walked ahead with an unhurried pace, though his steps carried an unspoken certainty, as if the path was one he had walked 100 times before. Morty followed close, his mind lingering on the horizon they had just left behind. The memory of it clung to him like a half-remembered dream, too vast to hold fully, yet too vivid to forget. Each step forward felt like a departure, like leaving behind something sacred he had only begun to understand. Still he pressed on, because forward was the only direction the road ever allowed. For a time they did not speak. The forest filled the silence with its own quiet language, the creak of branches, the distant call of unseen birds, the hush of wind sliding through narrow spaces. Morty listened with half-closed eyes, letting the rhythm of their footsteps merge with the pulse of the woods. At length he spoke, his voice careful, as though uncertain if the silence wanted to be broken. "Do you ever get tired of it? The moving, the never stopping? Don't you ever just want to stay somewhere?" Rick didn't slow, though his shoulders shifted slightly as if the words had brushed against him. "Staying still gets you trapped. Moving keeps you ahead of the trap." "But what if the trap never comes?" Morty asked, more to himself than to Rick. Rick finally glanced over his shoulder. His gaze was steady, almost piercing. "The trap always comes." Then he turned back, the conversation falling into the quiet weight of inevitability. Morty's steps faltered for a moment. He wanted to argue, to say that maybe some places were safe, that maybe some moments didn't need to end. But something in Rick's tone silenced him. It wasn't just certainty, it was memory, worn deep like grooves in stone. The path curved downward, following a stream that cut through the forest floor. Water ran clear over smooth stones, its voice soft but constant. Morty crouched as they walked, dipping his hand into the cool current, watching droplets bead on his skin before falling back. For a moment, he let himself smile. Rick stopped a few paces ahead, waiting without impatience. His eyes flicked to the stream, then to the boy. "Don't drink too much. Flow looks clean, but you never know what's upstream." Morty nodded, rising to his feet, wiping his hand on his shirt. "It feels, alive, like it's going somewhere. Carrying things." Rick gave a faint sound that might have been agreement. Everything's going somewhere. Some things just know it better than others. They followed the stream for a long stretch, the sound of it guiding them. Eventually the forest began to thin, the trees sparser, the light stronger. The ground opened into a meadow wide and quiet, its grasses bending under the steady breath of the wind. Flowers dotted the expanse, their colors muted yet steady, small bursts of persistence against the green. Morty slowed as they stepped into it, his eyes sweeping the vast openness. After the tight enclosure of the forest, the meadow felt almost fragile, exposed beneath the unbroken sky. "It's beautiful," he whispered, his voice carried away by the breeze. Rick stood beside him, his coat moving softly with the wind. He didn't answer right away, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the meadow stretched to meet distant hills. When he did speak, his words were quiet, edged with something Morty couldn't name. "Beauty doesn't mean safety." They crossed the meadow slowly, their shadows stretching long behind them. Morty brushed his hand across the tall grasses as he walked, the blades whispering against his palm. He thought of how small each one was, yet how they moved together, a sea of green shifting with the same breath. Halfway through the meadow, they stopped. Rick crouched, studying the ground. The soil was marked with faint impressions, too orderly to be random. Morty leaned close, squinting. "What is it?" "Tracks," Rick muttered. "Not human, too heavy, too wide." He pressed his fingers lightly into one, measuring the depth. His eyes narrowed. "Big, and not long ago?" Morty's chest tightened. The meadow, once open and calm, suddenly felt watchful, as if unseen eyes hid within the grasses. He swallowed hard, his voice small. "Should we turn back?" Rick straightened, shaking his head. "Back's never safer than forward. Keep moving." They walked again, this time faster, their silence heavier. Every shift of grass, every flicker of shadow felt alive with possibility. Morty's heart thudded, but Rick's stride never wavered. At last, they reached the far edge of the meadow where the land began to rise again into low hills. The forest loomed beyond, darker and denser than before, its entrance a wall of shadow. Rick paused, glancing back across the meadow they had crossed. His face gave nothing away, but his eyes lingered a little too long on the emptiness behind them. Morty followed his gaze, shivering, though the air was not cold. The meadow swayed gently in the wind, innocent and unbroken, yet the memory of the tracks clung to him. It was as if the land itself had whispered a warning they could not yet understand. Rick finally turned, stepping toward the hills. Morty hurried to follow, his voice hushed. "Do you think whatever left those tracks is still out there?" Rick didn't look back. "Everything leaves a trail, Morty. The trick is not being the one that gets followed." The boy fell silent, his thoughts heavy, his steps quick. Together they entered the shadow of the hills, leaving the meadow behind. The grasses swayed once more in the wind, as though erasing their passage, until the land stood quiet again, keeping its secrets. and as the sun began its slow arc across the sky, the two travelers pressed forward, unaware of how close the unseen had already come. The hills rose gently, their slopes veiled in shadows that deepened as Rick and Morty moved between them. The air here was different, cooler, touched by a faint dampness that clung to the stones underfoot. Every sound seemed to echo a little longer, as if the hills themselves were listening, their quietness stretched taut around each. Footfall. Morty drew his arms closer to his chest, glancing behind them more than once. The meadow lay out of sight now, swallowed by the curves of the land, but the memory of those tracks clung stubbornly to his thoughts. "Rick," he whispered, his voice trembling despite his effort to steady it. What if it's following us?" Rick didn't stop, his stride sure and deliberate. "Then it's already closer than you think," he said, matter of fact, though his eyes flicked briefly to the ridges above them, scanning, calculating. Morty shivered. He wanted reassurance, but Rick's words left none. Still, there was a strange steadiness in his bluntness, an honesty that told Morty he wasn't being treated like a child. Fear was real, danger was real, but so was the path forward. The hills narrowed into a shallow pass, stone walls climbing on either side. Moss clung thickly to the rock, damp beneath the shadows, and the air grew heavy, the wind muffled as if it dared not disturb the silence. Morty's breath came quicker, loud in his own ears. Rick finally slowed, crouching low to study the ground. His fingers traced faint impressions in the dirt, shallow yet deliberate. He muttered something under his breath, words Morty couldn't catch. "What is it?" Morty asked, his voice almost a plea. Rick stood again, brushing the soil from his hands. His face revealed little, but his eyes narrowed as they swept the passage ahead. Not the same tracks as before, smaller but not harmless. Morty swallowed. The pass suddenly felt like a throat, narrow and closing, and he was the breath caught inside it. He moved closer to Rick, his steps quicker to match. The silence pressed on them until even Rick's voice felt strange when he spoke again. "Listen, Morty, fear doesn't make you weaker, it just sharpens you. But if you freeze, if you let it swallow you whole, that's when you're gone." Morty tried to nod, but his throat felt tight. He thought of the meadow, of the grasses swaying in the wind, of how small he had felt beneath that open sky. And now, in this narrow stone passage, he felt even smaller, as if the world was folding in on him. They emerged from the pass into a hollow where the hills dipped together. At its center lay a pool, its water dark and still, reflecting the grey light of the sky. Around its edges, reeds swayed faintly, though no breeze touched them. The air was heavy, laden with the scent of wet earth. Rick stopped at the edge of the pool, crouching once more. Morty hung back, his eyes darting to the shadows that pooled at the base of the rocks. "Rick," he whispered, "why are we stopping? Shouldn't we keep moving?" Rick dipped his hand into the pool, lifting water that gleamed silver in the dim light. He let it fall back slowly, watching the ripples spread. Every place tells you something if you're patient enough to listen. Rushing just blinds you. Morty bit his lip, his gaze restless. The reeds seemed to shiver, though the air remained still. Somewhere, faint but unmistakable, a sound echoed, a low, resonant hum, almost too deep to hear. It vibrated more than it spoke, as if the earth itself carried a memory. Rick rose to his feet, his expression unreadable. "We're not alone here." The words sank heavy into Morty's chest. His heart pounded as he searched the hollow, eyes darting between shadows, water, reeds. "What do you mean? Where?" Rick didn't answer directly. He adjusted the strap of his coat, scanning the edges of the pool. Not close enough to strike, but close enough to watch. Morty's skin prickled. The thought of unseen eyes on him was unbearable. He wanted to scream, to run, to hide, but the hollow offered no comfort. The pool was too still, the stones too silent, the reeds too alive. Rick began moving again, not fast, but with deliberate steps that circled the pool. Morty followed, though his body screamed to flee. The hum grew fainter, swallowed by silence once more, but the memory of it lingered like a vibration in his bones. They left the hollow through a narrow cut in the hills, the air growing lighter as they climbed. Morty dared a glance back, half expecting to see something emerge from the water, something vast and ancient. But the pool remained still, its surface unbroken, as though it had never held a secret at all. As they climbed higher, the wind returned, carrying with it the scent of pine and stone. Morty breathed deeply, relief mingling with unease. He looked at Rick, searching his face for reassurance. "Do you think it'll follow us?" Rick's gaze remained forward. "Everything follows something, Morty. That's the way of the world. What matters is how far ahead you stay." The answer gave Morty no comfort, yet it carried a strange strength. He nodded, his steps firmer, as if the act of moving itself was enough to defy the weight of what lingered behind. The hills opened at last into a plateau, high above the winding valleys below. From here, the horizon stretched endless, layers of blue and grey fading into distance. The wind tugged at their clothes, carrying whispers from far-off places. Morty stood at the edge, his fear slowly giving way to awe. "It feels like the world just keeps unfolding. No matter how far you go, there's always more." Rick stood beside him, his gaze hard, yet softened by the fading light. "That's the truth of it. The world doesn't end, Morty, but people do, and that's why you keep moving." The boy fell silent, letting the words settle. The horizon stretched before him, vast and unknowable, and though fear still lingered in his chest, it was tempered by something else, a fragile thread of resolve. Together they turned from the edge, stepping once more onto the winding path that disappeared into the unknown, carrying with them both the silence of what watched and the endlessness of what lay ahead. The path across the plateau wound like a ribbon of pale stone, stretching between jagged rocks and open sky. Rick walked with steady steps, his coat pulling against the wind, while Morty struggled to keep pace, his small frame buffeted by gusts that seemed intent on pushing him back toward the valleys below. Each step forward felt like defiance, as though the world itself was testing their resolve. The silence of the high ground was different from the valleys. It wasn't thick or stifling, but thin, almost brittle, broken only by the sigh of the wind. It gave the land an exposed feeling, as if they were walking on the skin of the world itself, every movement noticed by unseen eyes. Morty clutched the straps of his pack, glancing toward the horizon. The clouds shifted endlessly, low and heavy like drifting ships. He imagined something hidden in them, vast forms circling above, though each time he blinked, there was only grey. "Rick," he asked softly, "how do you know where we're going? I mean, it all looks the same up here." Rick didn't slow. His eyes, sharp beneath the shadow of his brow, flicked between ridges, valleys, and the tilt of the sun. "Land talks if you learn its language. Shadows, wind, stone, they'll guide you better than any map." Morty frowned. He tried to see what Rick saw, but all he found were rocks and endless sky. What if I can't learn it? What if I never understand? Rick finally looked at him, his gaze steady, almost weary. "Then you listen to those who do. Not everything needs to be learned at once, Morty. Sometimes surviving means trusting." The words settled in Morty's chest like a weight, but not an unwelcome one. He nodded slowly, letting the silence stretch between them. For a time, their footsteps were the only rhythm, a quiet beat against the earth. As the day waned, the light shifted, painting the plateau in muted gold. Shadows stretched long, and the air grew colder, the kind of chill that seemed to seep into bone. Morty rubbed his arms, glancing toward Rick. "Do you think we'll stop soon? It feels like we've been walking forever." Rick didn't answer at first. He lifted his head, scanning the land ahead, then nodded toward a cluster of stone outcrops half hidden against the slope. "We'll camp there. Less wind." Relief washed over Morty, though fatigue still clung to him. When they reached the rocks, Rick moved with practiced ease, arranging a small fire from scraps of dried grass and brittle branches gathered along the way. Soon a faint flame crackled to life, its glow soft but steady, a fragile defiance against the vast cold of the plateau. Morty huddled close, watching the firelight dance against Rick's face. The flames seemed to etch deeper lines into his features, shadows of stories Morty had never heard. "Rick," he whispered after a long pause, "do you ever get tired of it? Always moving? Always being hunted or watching for what's out there?" Rick poked at the fire, sending a small spray of sparks into the air. He stared at them as they vanished into the night. "Tired? Sure, but stopping doesn't change what's behind you, just makes it catch up faster." Morty lowered his gaze, staring into the fire. The thought was heavy, almost too heavy for him, yet it carried a truth he couldn't deny. "I don't know if I'm strong enough for that." Rick's voice softened, though it carried the weight of iron. "Strength isn't what you think, Morty. It's not about being fearless. It's about walking anyway, even when fear digs its claws in. You're stronger than you realize, otherwise you wouldn't still be here." The words struck something deep in Morty, a quiet ember of resolve he hadn't known was there. He wanted to believe them. He needed to. The night deepened, the stars faint above the heavy clouds. The fire burned low, its warmth fragile against the vastness of the plateau. Morty lay curled near it, eyes heavy, while Rick remained awake, his gaze scanning the darkness. Far off, carried by the wind, came a sound. It was faint, almost imagined, a low howl that rose and fell, like a voice carried across endless distance. Morty stirred in his half-sleep, his body tense. "Rick, did you hear that?" Rick's eyes narrowed, his hand tightening on the strap of his coat. "Yeah, don't move, just listen." The sound came again, closer this time, a haunting echo that seemed to circle the rocks. It wasn't just an animal's cry, it was layered, almost like words, spoken in a language too old to grasp. Morty's heart hammered as he clutched at the blanket wrapped around him. Rick stood slowly, stepping beyond the fire's glow. His silhouette loomed tall against the starlit sky, a figure both fragile and unyielding. The wind whipped at his coat as the sound faded once more into silence. For a long moment nothing followed. Only the sighing wind, the crackle of the dying fire, and Morty's quick, uneven breaths. Rick returned to the fire at last, his expression unreadable. "It's further off than it sounds, but it's real, and it knows we're here." Morty's throat tightened. "What do we do?" Rick settled beside him, gaze fixed on the horizon. "The same thing we always do. Rest when we can, move when we must, and never forget, it's not the dark that hunts you, it's what waits inside it." Morty lay awake, long after, his eyes fixed on the dim glow of the embers. The words echoed in his mind, heavy but steady, carrying both fear and a strange, quiet strength. At last, exhaustion pulled him under, though his dreams were restless, filled with shadows that moved like whispers across the plateau. When morning came, the fire was ash, the sky pale and cold. Rick was already standing, his gaze fixed toward the rising sun, as though it might reveal what lay ahead. Morty rose slowly, his body aching, but he followed without complaint. Together they stepped once more, into the endless expanse, the wind carrying with it the faint memory of the howl and the knowledge that something unseen still walked behind them. The morning broke without warmth. A thin veil of pale light spread across the plateau, but it carried no comfort, no promise of ease. The wind was gentler than the night before, though it still whispered across the stones with a voice that felt older than either of them could name. Rick adjusted the straps of his pack, his movements precise, economical, as though each action had been repeated countless times. Morty followed behind, blinking against the brightness that bled from the horizon. For a while they said nothing. Their footsteps marked the silence, steady and soft, the only rhythm in a world that seemed endless. Morty's legs ached, but he didn't complain. He had learned that complaints did not stop the march of time or the demands of the road. Instead, he tried to keep his thoughts quiet, though they pressed at him like the wind, questions, doubts, and fears he could not name. It was Rick who broke the silence first. "You ever notice how empty doesn't always mean safe?" Morty looked up at him, startled. "What do you mean?" Rick tilted his head toward the horizon. The land stretched without end, bare stone, shifting clouds, no trees, no walls, no sign of life. Places like this trick you. No walls, no enemies in sight, so you start thinking you're free. But out here, you're naked to whatever's watching. No cover, no escape, just the sky looking down. Morty shivered, though the sun had already risen. "So, you think something is watching us, like last night?" Rick's gaze hardened. "I don't think, I know. The land doesn't echo like that unless it's answering something alive." The thought gnawed at Morty. He turned it over in his mind as they walked, trying not to glance back over his shoulder too often. Every time he did, the horizon behind them was still empty, only the shimmer of distance, the trembling air where the sky bent down to meet the earth. But he couldn't shake the feeling of weight on his back, like unseen eyes pressing into him. By midday the land began to change. The flat stone broke into ridges, and the wind carried with it a faint smell, dry, metallic, sharp against the senses. Rick slowed, crouching to press his hand against the earth. Morty waited, watching him. "What is it?" he whispered. Rick didn't look up. "The ground's been split, not by weather, not by time. Something carved through here." He traced the edge of the stone, where deep scars ran like claw marks across the surface. The grooves were too even, too deliberate. "It's a trail, old but not forgotten." Morty swallowed. "A trail to what?" Rick stood, brushing dust from his hands. "Doesn't matter. Trails mean movement, movement means life, and life means danger or answers." They followed the scarred path, the ridges rising higher around them, the plateau narrowing into a shallow pass. Shadows gathered in the cracks, long fingers reaching across their way. Morty felt the air grow heavier, each breath thick in his chest. "Rick, this doesn't feel right." Rick gave a dry laugh, though there was no humor in it. "It isn't. But wrong places are where truths hide." The path twisted, and suddenly the land opened into a hollow, a vast bowl carved into the plateau. The stone walls rose around them, and in the center lay what at first seemed like a ruin. Jagged pillars jutted from the ground, half buried in dust, their surfaces etched with strange marks that caught the fading sunlight. Morty stopped dead. What is this place? Rick's eyes lingered on the markings. A memory, written in stone. He stepped forward, his boots crunching on the brittle earth. Morty, places like this, people don't stumble onto them. They're meant to be found when the time's right. Morty hesitated before following. The air within the hollow was different, still but charged, like the breath before a storm. He trailed his fingers along one of the pillars, tracing the grooves carved deep into it. The symbols were unfamiliar, yet they stirred something within him, a pull just beyond understanding. Rick crouched near the largest pillar, studying the lines with an intensity Morty rarely saw in him. His voice was quiet, almost reverent. These aren't just carvings, they're warnings, records. This place, it's older than anything we've walked through. Morty's heart raced. Older than us? Older than everything else we've seen? Rick looked up, his eyes sharp. Older than memory? Older than the things that chase us? He paused, letting the silence stretch. This is where it started. Morty's breath caught. Started? What started? Rick didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pressed his hand against the stone, his palm flat against the etchings. For a long moment he was still, his eyes closed, as though listening. When he spoke again, his voice was low, almost a whisper. The hunger, the call in the dark, the thing that doesn't stop. Morty shivered. The hollow seemed to close in around him, the air pressing heavier against his skin. You mean the thing that's been following us? Rick's gaze met his, and Morty saw the weight there, the shadows of truths too heavy to carry. Not just us. Everything. Everywhere. The words echoed in Morty's chest, too vast to fully grasp. He stepped back, shaking his head. But, Rick, if it's everywhere, if it's always been, how do you fight something like that? Rick's expression hardened, though his voice was steady. You don't fight it. You endure, you outlast, you carry the story so it doesn't erase you completely. Morty stared at him, the firelight of belief wavering inside. But that's not winning. Rick stood, his figure stark, against the rising walls of stone. Morty, sometimes survival is the only kind of victory left. The hollow fell silent again, save for the distant sigh of wind moving through unseen cracks. Morty hugged himself, his skin prickling, as though the very air around them remembered what had once passed through. When they finally left the hollow, the sky had grown darker, clouds gathering thick above the plateau. Rick moved quickly, his strides longer, more urgent, as though the act of leaving was itself a race against time. Morty stumbled to keep up, casting one last glance behind him at the stone pillars fading into shadow. The symbols seemed to shift in the dimming light, twisting into forms he could almost, but not quite, recognize. They camped that night beneath an overhang of stone, their fire small, the flames trembling in the wind. Morty couldn't shake the image of the hollow, the carvings etched like scars into the world itself. He lay awake, staring at the embers, his thoughts a tangle of fear and awe. Rick sat nearby, silent, his gaze fixed not on the fire but on the horizon beyond. His shoulders were tense, his jaw set. Morty wanted to ask what he was thinking, but he already knew the answer. The howl did not come that night, but the silence that replaced it was worse, deep, watching, endless. And in that silence, Morty understood, the world they walked through was not empty. It was remembering. And memory, once stirred, was a weight no silence could bury. The dawn arrived quietly as though reluctant to reveal itself. A pale wash of light spread across the plateau, dim and muted, like a memory struggling to take form. Morty woke slowly, his body heavy, his mind weighed down by the echoes of the hollow they had left behind. The carvings still lingered in his thoughts, lines cut so deep, they seemed carved not only into stone, but into him as well. Rick was already awake, crouched near the fire pit where only a faint trace of smoke curled upward. He had not slept, Morty could tell by the tautness of his shoulders, the tired sharpness in his eyes. He was staring at the horizon again as though the world itself might shift if he looked long enough. "Rick," Morty said softly, his voice scratchy with sleep. "You didn't rest, did you?" Rick didn't answer right away. He brushed ash from his fingers, his gaze never leaving the dim expanse ahead. "Rest isn't what I need," he murmured finally. "Not here. Not now." Morty sat up, pulling his blanket tighter around himself. The air was colder, sharper, as though the night had left behind more than darkness. "What's waiting for us out there?" Rick turned then, meeting Morty's eyes. His expression was unreadable, though his voice carried a gravity that sank into Morty's chest. "Not what? Who?" The words settled between them like a stone dropped in still water, rippling outward, unavoidable. Morty swallowed hard. "You mean someone's been following?"
Us. Rick's silence was its own answer. They began walking soon after, their pace faster, driven by a tension that pressed at them like invisible hands. The land changed gradually as they went, the stone flattening again, the wind carrying with it a low hum, so faint Morty thought at first it was only in his head. But as the hours passed, the sound grew clearer, weaving itself into the air like a song too ancient to understand. Morty glanced nervously at Rick. "Do you hear that?" Rick's eyes narrowed. "It's not the wind." The sound swelled and faded, rising like a chant, falling like a sigh. It came from everywhere and nowhere, from the stone beneath their feet and the sky above their heads. Morty tried to block it out, but it crept into his bones, filling him with a restlessness he couldn't name. By midday, the horizon broke open to reveal another shape, dark against the pale land, a structure, distant yet unmistakable. Morty squinted, his heart thudding. "Is that a building?" Rick shielded his eyes with one hand, his jaw tightening. "Not a building, a monument." As they drew closer, the details sharpened. It rose from the earth like a jagged tooth, black stone thrust skyward, its surface veined with cracks that glowed faintly as though light pulsed beneath the skin of the rock. Around it lay fragments, shattered pieces, scattered like bones. Morty slowed, unease prickling at his skin. "It feels wrong." Rick's gaze was steady, unflinching. "That's because it is." The monument loomed taller with each step, its shadow stretching long across the plain. The hum in the air grew louder, resonating now with the cracks in the stone, a rhythm that seemed to echo Morty's own heartbeat. When they reached the base, Morty felt his knees weaken, the sheer presence of it pressed down, immense and suffocating. Rick approached the monument with deliberate steps, his hand hovering near its surface, but not touching. His voice was quiet, but the words cut through the air with precision. "This is where it was called, the hunger, the endless voice." Morty's breath caught. "Called? You mean someone brought it here?" Rick nodded slowly, his face shadowed. "Nothing this vast comes uninvited." Morty stared at the cracks glowing faintly beneath the stone. Who would call something like that?" Rick's mouth twisted into something between a grimace and a smile. "The same kind of people who think they can control the storm by naming it. Who think survival is worth the price of summoning what should never be woken." Morty shivered, his thoughts swirling. "And now it's everywhere, following us."
Rick finally touched the stone, his fingers brushing its surface. A shudder passed through the monument, faint but undeniable. Morty stepped back instinctively. Rick didn't flinch. "It's not just following us, Morty, it's remembering us. Once you've stood in its shadow, it never lets you go." The hum swelled suddenly, deep and resonant, vibrating through the ground. Morty gasped, clutching at his chest as though the sound had burrowed inside him. The cracks in the monument flared brighter, light spilling outward in sharp, jagged bursts. "Rick!" Morty cried. "What's happening?" Rick's eyes remained locked on the monument, his voice steady despite the chaos building around them. "It knows we're here, and it wants us to listen." Morty's fear tangled with awe, his body trembling as the sound deepened into words, not words he could understand, but something older, larger, like the earth itself speaking in a tongue beyond human grasp. The stone seemed alive, its fractures glowing like veins of fire. Rick pulled his hand back sharply, breaking the connection. The glow dimmed, though the hum lingered in the air like a fading echo. His face was pale, his eyes shadowed. "We can't stay here." Morty stumbled after him as they retreated from the monument, his heart pounding in his ears. "Rick, what was that? What did it say?" Rick shook his head, his steps quick, urgent. "Not in words you'd understand. Not yet. But it was a promise. Or a warning." The plain stretched before them again, but Morty couldn't shake the image of the monument burning behind his eyes. He felt as though something had been planted inside him, a seed waiting to grow. By nightfall, they found shelter beneath a fractured ridge. The stars above were faint, blurred by the thickening clouds. Morty sat close to the fire, his arms wrapped around himself. "Rick, do you ever wonder if we're supposed to find these places, like someone's leading us here?" Rick poked at the fire with a stick, the flames crackling in answer. His voice was low, weary. "Wondering doesn't change the path. Whether it's chance or design, we're still walking it." Morty looked down, his thoughts heavy. But what if the path doesn't lead out? What if it only leads deeper in? Rick glanced at him, and for a moment the hardness in his eyes softened. "Then we walk deeper, because stopping means letting it catch us. And I won't let that happen." The fire sputtered, its light flickering against the stone walls around them. Morty closed his eyes, trying to will himself into sleep, though his heart still raced with the echo of the monument's hum. Rick sat awake long after, his gaze fixed once more on the horizon. He had heard the voice more clearly than Morty, felt the weight of its promise in his bones, and though he would not say it aloud, he knew the truth that loomed unspoken between them. The hunger was not coming, it was already here. The night stretched long and heavy, filled with whispers that did not belong to the wind. Morty drifted in and out of uneasy dreams, each one tangled with the pulse of the monument they had left behind. Whenever his eyes fluttered open, the shadows seemed deeper, shifting as if something waited just beyond the reach of the firelight. Rick did not sleep. His silhouette remained sharp against the embers, his eyes reflecting the glow, unblinking, relentless. Morty stirred once, catching the faint tremor in Rick's hand as he held the flask near his lips. It was rare to see him falter, even slightly. Morty looked away, curling into his blanket, pretending not to notice. At dawn, the fire had died, and so had Morty's fragile comfort. The landscape was grey again, but the air had changed, thicker, heavier, as if carrying an unspoken weight. They gathered their few belongings in silence, the unspoken tension between them louder than words. "Rick," Morty began quietly, his voice almost swallowed by the wind. "When you touch that monument, It felt like something woke up inside me too, like I heard it even though I didn't understand. Rick slung his pack over his shoulder, his jaw clenched tight. That's because it did. The voice doesn't whisper to one, it whispers to all who stand near. Morty shivered. So, is it in me now, like a part of it? Rick paused, meeting his gaze. His expression softened for only a moment, but it was enough to send a chill down Morty's spine. It doesn't take, not yet. It just waits. They set off across the plain, the land slowly breaking apart into deep fissures and scarred ground. The hum from before seemed quieter, but it was not gone. It lingered beneath the surface like a low vibration in the earth itself. By midday, the fissures deepened into chasms so wide they had to turn and search for narrow crossings. Morty kept glancing down into them, shuddering at the way the darkness inside seemed to move, curling like smoke. He pulled his eyes away quickly each time, but curiosity always dragged them back. "Don't look too long," Rick warned, without turning his head. Morty's stomach tightened. "Why? What's down there?" Rick's voice was flat, heavy with meaning. "Not down. In. There's a difference." They pressed onward, but the sense of being watched only grew stronger. Morty could feel it crawling along his skin, a presence that trailed behind and ahead at the same time. Once, he thought he heard footsteps echoing their own, only to realize the sound came from inside the fissures. The silence between them cracked at last when Morty blurted out, "Rick, but why us? Out of everyone, why do we keep finding these places? Why does it feel like we're being pulled into the middle of all this?" Rick slowed, his shoulders sagging. For a moment he looked older, more fragile, as though the weight of years had pressed down on him all at once. Because we can still see it. Most don't. Most walk past and never notice. But you and me. His voice trailed off. We're the ones cursed to notice. Morty's throat went dry. He wanted to argue, to say there was nothing special about him, but the memory of the monument's hum inside his chest silenced the thought. As evening approached, they came upon a ridge of stone that rose above the plain like a wall. The path narrowed as they climbed, jagged rocks jutting out on either side. At the top, the world opened again, but not into emptiness. Far below, nestled in the hollow of the earth, was a settlement. Morty gasped. The sight of people, actual figures moving, smoke curling from fires, lights flickering in the gloom, sent a rush of hope through him. "Rick, look, there's a town!" Rick's eyes narrowed. He did not share Morty's relief. "A settlement, yes, but not one you should rush into with open arms." They descended carefully, the path winding down toward the hollow. As they neared, the sounds reached them, voices, faint but real, mingling with the clatter of tools and the cry of animals. Morty felt his chest swell. For so long there had been only silence, only him and Rick against the empty world. The presence of others felt like stepping into a dream. The people noticed them as they approached. Figures paused in their work, eyes turning toward the strangers on the ridge. Their faces were hard, pale from years beneath dim skies, but their gazes carried both suspicion and something else, curiosity, or perhaps hunger. A man stepped forward, tall and broad, his face lined with age. He carried no weapon, but his stance spoke of strength. "Travelers," he said, his voice deep. "Few come this way." Rick inclined his head slightly, his tone guarded. "We move with the road, nothing more." The man studied them for a long moment before nodding. "Then you are welcome, if only for the night. Food and fire are not things we deny." Morty's relief was almost overwhelming. His stomach growled at the promise of food. his body aching for warmth beyond a dying campfire. "Thank you," he breathed. They were led into the heart of the settlement. The houses were carved from stone, their surfaces etched with patterns too deliberate to be decoration alone. Morty caught himself staring at them, the carvings faintly reminiscent of the monument's lines. His unease returned, twisting inside his gut. That night they sat among the people, eating coarse bread and drinking water that tasted faintly of minerals. Morty listened to the voices around him, the laughter that flickered briefly in the gloom. For a moment it almost felt normal. But Rick did not relax. His eyes kept darting to the carvings on the walls, to the shadows where the firelight did not reach. An elder woman sat across from them, her eyes clouded yet piercing. She leaned closer, her voice low but sharp enough to cut. "You've stood in its shadow, haven't you?" Morty froze, bread halfway to his mouth. Rick's expression hardened. "We've stood in many shadows." The woman shook her head slowly. "Not like this. I see it in your eyes. The hum doesn't leave once it finds you." Morty felt the blood drain from his face. You hear it?"
Two. A ripple passed through the listeners nearby, their conversations quieting, their faces turning toward him. The woman's smile was thin, brittle. "We all hear it, always. It called us here, long ago. We stay because there is nowhere else to go." Rick set his cup down with deliberate calm. "And so you carve its lines into your walls. You make it part of your lives." The woman nodded once. "It is already part of us. Pretending otherwise changes nothing." Morty's chest tightened. The hope he had felt only hours before drained away, leaving only dread. He realized now that this settlement was no refuge. It was a place claimed, bound by the same voice that haunted them. That night, lying on a hard stone bed, Morty could not sleep. The hum was louder here, woven into every wall, every breath. He turned to Rick in the darkness. "Rick, are we safe here?" Rick's silence stretched long before he finally whispered, "No, not here, not anywhere." Morty closed his eyes, trembling. The laughter he had heard earlier seemed distant now, hollow. The people outside did not live free. They endured, bound by something unseen, something eternal. And Morty knew with a sinking heart that he and Rick had only stepped deeper into the shadow they could never escape. The morning light filtered weakly through the clouds, casting the settlement in muted tones of grey and gold. Morty rose from his stone bed, muscles stiff and mind restless. The hum in the walls was constant, a subtle vibration beneath his skin, a reminder that the voice they had fled from was never truly gone. Rick was already awake, sitting outside the small house they had been given, staring toward the ridge where the plateau met the horizon. Morty joined him quietly, wrapping his arms around himself against the chill. "Rick, I didn't sleep. I couldn't stop thinking about last night. About the hum. About them." Rick didn't turn immediately. When he finally did, his gaze was steady, but there was a softness Morty rarely saw in him. "Most people never hear it, Morty. They live their lives thinking the world ends at the horizon. But the truth never rests. And neither should we." Morty shivered. "But what do we do? Every time we think we're moving forward, it's like we're stepping deeper into it." Rick's hands tightened around his knees. "We keep walking, one step at a time. That's all anyone ever really does, Morty, even the ones who've lived here a lifetime." They left the settlement at last, the paths twisting down through narrow valleys, each step echoing faintly against the stone. Morty noticed the carvings on the houses as they passed, lines and shapes that mirrored the monument they had seen. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable once he recognized it. A chill ran down his spine. "The hum," Morty whispered. "It's stronger here." Rick nodded, eyes scanning the horizon. Everything
Leaves a trace, Morty. The closer we are to it, the louder it becomes. You feel it because you're sensitive. That's not weakness, that's perception. Morty swallowed, trying to imagine perception as strength. It was difficult, especially as the fissures and ridges of the land seemed to close in, pressing against him with every step. The plateau had become a labyrinth, a place where the air itself was heavy with memory and intention. By midday, they reached a narrow pass between two cliffs. Morty's legs ached, his pack digging into his shoulders, but the view beyond the pass forced him to stop. The valley spread out below them, vast and dark, with rivers of shadow winding through it like veins. At the center was another structure, larger and more ominous than the monument. Morty's stomach churned. Rick followed his gaze, his face set in hard lines. "That's where it begins to bind." The core Morty's voice trembled. "Bind? What does that mean?" Rick's eyes did not waver. "It means everything that's been waiting, watching, whispering. It collects there, it's the heart of it all, and if we go, we must be ready." Morty hesitated, fear gripping him. "Ready? How can anyone be ready for something like that?" Rick's lips pressed into a thin line. "You never are. You just walk anyway." The descent into the valley was slow and careful. The wind that had once driven across the plateau was replaced by a silence so complete it seemed to press against Morty's ears. Every crack in the earth, every shadow between stones, felt alive. He tried not to glance down into the depths, but curiosity clawed at him relentlessly. When they reached the valley floor, the air was thick with a strange metallic tang. Morty's throat burned as he breathed it in, and he felt the pulse of the place beneath his feet, like a heartbeat buried deep within the land. The larger structure loomed ahead, black stone etched with the same glowing lines he had seen before, now larger and more intricate, almost alive with light. "This is it," Rick whispered, his voice low. "The core. Everything converges here. Everything waits here." Morty's chest tightened. "And the hum? It's louder now. It's inside me. I can feel it." Rick nodded. "That's why you're here, Morty. To hear it, to understand it, to endure it." They approached the structure cautiously. The closer they got, the more the lines on the stone seemed to pulse, like veins carrying energy, like a memory reaching outward. Morty reached out instinctively, brushing his hand along one edge, and the light flared brighter, almost blinding him. He pulled back sharply. Rick placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. "It's all right. It's testing you, not attacking. Just seeing if you notice, if you feel. It feeds on awareness, Morty, that's all." Morty's mind swirled with questions, but Rick didn't answer most of them. He didn't need to. His calm presence, grounded Morty, gave him the courage to keep moving forward despite the fear twisting inside. They circled the structure slowly, taking in every line, every fissure, every glow. Morty realized that these formations were not random. They were patterns, a language that whispered through the stone. Though he couldn't read it, he felt its meaning: patience, endurance, observation. The hum in his chest grew steady, resonant, almost like a pulse matching his own heartbeat. Rick's voice broke through the quiet. "Morty, remember this. It's not about fighting it. It's not about conquering. It's about walking through it, holding yourself together while the world tries to pull you apart. That's what matters. That's the measure of strength." Morty nodded slowly, swallowing the lump in his throat. He wanted to argue, to question, but the clarity in Rick's words cut through the fear. He took a deep breath and matched Rick's steps, moving alongside him, feeling the pulse of the valley beneath them, letting the hum sink into his bones. Night fell slowly, bringing darkness that seemed to soak into the stone itself. The valley glowed faintly, the lines on the structure radiating soft light. Morty huddled near the fire they had built, exhaustion pressing down on him, yet he couldn't stop thinking about the patterns, the pulse, the hum inside. Rick sat across from him, eyes scanning the horizon, never letting the darkness catch him unaware. Morty watched him and realized again how unflinching Rick could be in the face of all this. It was not fearlessness. It was endurance, the kind of strength Morty had yet to fully grasp. The night stretched on. Morty's eyelids grew heavy, but he did not sleep. He listened to the hum, let it fill him, and slowly it became a rhythm he could follow. A rhythm that promised that even in the vastness, even in the endless darkness, walking forward, step by step, was a victory in itself. As Morty finally drifted into sleep, he felt Rick's hand briefly on his shoulder. Not a gesture of comfort, but of acknowledgement. They were still here, they were still moving, and for now that was enough. The first light of dawn crept gently across the valley, spilling pale gold over the stone and the glowing lines of the structure. Morty stirred slowly, wrapped in a thin blanket, his body stiff from the long night, yet his mind felt lighter than it had in days. The hum that had haunted them all this way now felt distant, softened by the awakening of the world around them. Rick sat nearby, leaning against a smooth stone, eyes tracing the patterns that glimmered faintly in the early light. Morty watched him quietly, noticing the ease in his posture that had not been there for weeks. For once, the tension in Rick's shoulders seemed less like armor and more like a sigh. "You see it, Morty?" Rick's voice was calm, almost tender, carrying a weight of unspoken understanding. Morty nodded, his gaze sweeping across the valley and the monumental structure they had come to understand more fully. I think so. The hum, it doesn't scare me anymore. Not like before. I feel part of it, but not trapped." Rick gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "That's the point. It isn't meant to trap you. It's meant to remind you, to make you aware, to make you stronger in ways you can't always see." Morty's chest swelled with a strange pride. The journey, the fear, the weight of the voice, it had all led them here. And for the first time he felt as though he could breathe, unburdened by the constant vigilance that had shadowed every step. They packed their few belongings and began walking toward the edge of the valley, the path winding gently upward. The glow from the structure faded behind them, blending into the morning light, but its presence lingered, a quiet reminder that some truths were carried within, not left behind. Morty looked up at Rick as they walked. "Do you think we'll ever really leave it behind? Or the others we've seen, the settlements, the carvings, the hum?" Rick's gaze softened, fixed on the horizon. "We don't leave it behind, Morty. We carry it. Like a story, like a lesson. Everything we've seen, everything we've endured, stays with us. That's what makes us who we are. That's what keeps us walking forward, even when the shadows return." They reached the plateau's edge as the sun rose fully, casting long, gentle shadows over the land. Morty paused, taking a deep breath, letting the wind sweep over him, carrying with it a sense of peace he hadn't felt in a long while. He realized the fear that had followed them, the constant, unrelenting presence of something beyond comprehension, was still there, but it no longer defined him. Rick adjusted his pack and glanced at Morty, his expression quiet but reassuring. We're not heroes, Morty. Not in the way people tell stories. We're survivors, witnesses, learners. And sometimes that's enough. Morty nodded, understanding the depth of Rick's words. All the steps, all the encounters, all the tremors of fear and wonder, they were not about vanquishing the unknown, but about walking alongside it, acknowledging its presence and letting it shape who they were. The wind whispered through the plateau, carrying faint echoes of the settlements, of the carvings, of voices long past and long remembered. Morty felt it resonate within him, a rhythm that matched the pulse of his own heart. It was a lullaby of endurance, of memory, of quiet strength. They walked on side by side, their shadows stretching long and intertwined on the plateau. Every step forward was deliberate, unhurried, filled with the weight of lessons learned and the gentleness of hope. The valley behind them was still, the glow of the structure fading, as if bowing to their passage. Morty's thoughts wandered back to the settlements, to the people who endured silently, to the echoes of the hum that had once been unbearable. He understood now that survival was not about escaping. It was about noticing, remembering, and choosing to continue despite the incomprehensible. Rick's hand brushed briefly against Morty's shoulder, a gesture unspoken but filled with meaning. It was a promise, a reassurance, a shared understanding of all they had faced. Morty smiled faintly, feeling the weight of the journey settle into a quiet contentment. As they reached a gentle rise overlooking a far horizon, Morty paused again. "Rick, do you think we'll ever stop wandering?" Rick's gaze softened, distant yet steady. "Maybe not, and maybe that's okay. The journey is as much as the destination. We walk, Morty, because that's what keeps the story alive, and somewhere along the way we carry the light through the darkness, even when it feels small." Morty closed his eyes for a moment, letting the wind and the soft hum of memory fill him. The plateau stretched out endlessly, yet it no longer felt oppressive. Instead, it felt like a vast canvas, open and waiting, and for the first time he felt a part of it, not as prey, not as wanderers, but as beings who could bear the weight of the unknown and still find wonder. Rick started walking again, slow and deliberate. Morty followed, each step a small exhale of all the fear, awe, and learning that had carried them here. Behind them, the structures, the hum, the carvings, everything faded gently into memory, but the lessons remained alive, embedded deep within. The sun rose higher, spilling warmth over them. The wind carried a whisper of hope, of endurance, of quiet love for the strange and difficult journey they had shared. Morty felt the pulse of it in his chest, steady and comforting, like the rhythm of a heartbeat beneath a calm sky. And as they walked forward, the plateau stretching endless before them, Morty understood finally what Rick had always known. Survival, endurance, and remembering were enough. Not for glory, not for victory, but simply for living and continuing to move forward side by side. The horizon beckoned gently, and Morty let himself believe that no matter how vast the unknown, they would keep walking, and maybe, just maybe, that was all that mattered. He glanced at Rick one last time, a quiet gratitude filling him. The journey was far from over, but for the first time, the weight of fear had lifted, replaced by a calm awareness that carried both courage and peace. The sun spilled fully across the plateau. The wind whispered through the stones, soft and lingering. Morty took a deep breath, feeling the pulse of the world in him. And with that, he stretched into the light, letting every shadow and every hum settle into memory. "Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, man."